Valley Forge became immortal, not because an army won a battle there, but because an army almost came apart there and did not. That is the contradiction at the center of the place. No great winter assault broke across its hills. No famous charge decided the fate of the revolution on its frozen roads. During the encampment itself, from December 19th, 1777, to June 19th, 1778, there was no battle at Valley Forge. And yet the name has endured with the force of a battlefield. It stands for endurance, deprivation, sacrifice, and the dangerous question that hovered over George Washington's army. Could a revolution survive if its army could not be fed, clothed, housed, kept healthy, or kept together? The drama of Valley Forge was not the clash of armies. It was the slow violence of want. By the time Washington's troops entered the camp on December 19th, the British occupied Philadelphia, the American capital. The enemy was not far away. The war had not paused. But at Valley Forge, the Continental Army faced a different kind of contest. One fought through commissary wagons, flour barrels, cattle droves, hospital rooms, hut construction, sanitation orders, and the daily discipline required to keep thousands of exhausted people from slipping into despair. The National Park Service describes the encampment as lasting exactly 6 months, from December 19th, 1777, until June 19th, 1778. Those dates matter because they frame Valley Forge not as a single desperate night and not as a simple legend of footprints in snow, but as a sustained military occupation of a landscape. It was a winter city built by an army that had to create shelter, order, and survival systems almost as soon as it arrived. More than 12,000 soldiers entered Valley Forge. With them came about 400 women and children, people too often pushed to the edge of the story, but essential to the world of the army. They were part of the encampment's life, its labor, its suffering, and its daily human texture. Valley Forge was not merely rows of men under arms. It was a crowded, improvised community. Soldiers, officers, servants, families, animals, wagons, cooks, nurses, guards, craftsmen, messengers, and the machinery of an army trying to remain an army. This is why the absence of a battle is not an absence of conflict. A battlefield concentrates danger into hours. Valley Forge stretched danger across months. Imagine the scale before the myth hardens into a postcard. More than 12,000 soldiers had to be placed, sheltered, supplied, commanded, and kept from disease. Hundreds of women and children also needed food and protection. Animals had to be fed or driven in. Waste had to be managed. Roads and paths had to bear traffic in winter and mud. Hospitals had to receive the sick. Orders had to travel. Guards had to stand watch. Firewood had to be gathered. Bread, meat, spirits, peas or beans, milk, butter, vinegar, and soap existed in official ration expectations, but the existence of a ration on paper did not guarantee its arrival in a soldier's hands. The central struggle was not simply hunger, though hunger was real. It was the gap between the needs of a military city and the ability of revolutionary institutions to meet those needs. The commissary department was supposed to purchase, pack, and distribute rations. The quartermaster department was tied to the movement of supplies, transport, and material. When these systems failed or faltered, the danger was not inconvenience. It was dissolution. Washington understood that clearly. On December 23, 1777, only days after the army entered Valley Forge, he warned Congress that unless the commissary system changed, the army could be reduced to starvation, dissolution, or dispersal. That phrase is stark because it gives 3 possible endings to the encampment, and none of them required a British attack. Starvation meant physical collapse. Dissolution meant the army losing its structure. Dispersal meant men breaking apart from the force that Congress and Washington needed to keep in being. In other words, the revolution could fail in camp. That is what makes Valley Forge more than a story of suffering. Suffering alone does not explain its importance. Armies have suffered throughout history. What matters is that suffering pressed directly against the survival of the Continental Army as an institution. Hunger could become desertion. Illness could become military weakness. Shortages of shoes and clothing could turn trained soldiers into men unfit for duty. Administrative failure could become strategic defeat. A field report cited by Washington recorded 2,898 men unfit for duty because they were barefoot or otherwise inadequately clothed. That number is not a symbol. It is a measure of how material shortages became military reality. A soldier without shoes was not simply uncomfortable. He was less able to march, stand guard, build huts, move supplies, or fight if the British advanced. A shortage of blankets was not just misery at night. It weakened bodies already exposed to poor nutrition and disease. A lack of tools slowed construction. A lack of transport trapped food and equipment away from the men who needed them. At Valley Forge, the line between logistics and combat readiness nearly disappeared. Disease made the dangers still more severe. The National Park Service states that nearly 2,000 people died during the encampment, mostly from disease rather than combat. The common diseases associated with the camp included influenza, typhus, typhoid, and dysentery. Smallpox inoculation belonged to the medical world of the Army as well. These were not background conditions. They were among the central forces shaping the encampment. A crowded temporary city required hospitals, quarantine facilities, sanitation orders, surgeons, nurses, and inoculation programs because disease could do what British muskets did not do at Valley Forge: thin the army from within. The traditional image of Valley Forge often leans towards snow, bare feet, and silent endurance. Those images are not meaningless, but they are incomplete. The deeper story is organizational. How does an army feed thousands when supply systems fail? How does it maintain discipline when men are hungry and cold? How does command function when disease spreads through camp? How does a revolutionary government support soldiers in the field while the enemy holds one of the most important cities in America? How does loyalty survive when the daily evidence of neglect is visible in empty stomachs, worn clothing, and crowded hospitals? The encampment forced those questions into the open. It also forced the Army to build. Valley Forge became a place of construction as much as deprivation. The Continental Army raised more than 1,500 log huts and built about 2 miles of fortifications. Those works turned exposed ground into a military settlement. They also revealed that the men at Valley Forge were not passive victims of winter. They cut, hauled, shaped, dug, guarded, organized, and endured. Every hut was a form of shelter, but also a statement that the Army intended to remain. Every defensive work helped mark the landscape as a camp, prepared not merely to suffer, but to function. That distinction matters. Valley Forge was not chosen because Washington wanted a legend of misery. It was a military position in a war that was still unfolding. The British were in Philadelphia. Washington needed to watch them, contain them, and preserve his own army from destruction. The winter camp had to be close enough to matter and strong enough to survive. The place became famous for deprivation, but its first purpose was strategic. And so the story begins with a paradox. The most famous winter encampment of the American Revolution was not the scene of its famous winter battle. Its struggle was quieter, slower, and in some ways more dangerous. It was a test of whether a young republic could keep an army alive when the enemy held Philadelphia, when supply lines strained, when disease spread, when shoes failed, when official rations outran reality, and when Washington himself could imagine starvation, dissolution, or dispersal as possible outcomes. By June 19th, 1778, the Army marched out of Valley Forge. It had not escaped suffering. It had absorbed it. It had buried many of its dead, reorganized parts of its life, and remained in being. That survival is the reason Valley Forge endured in memory. Not because a battle was fought there, but because the army that entered in crisis did not vanish. To understand why it was there at all, the ground itself has to come into focus. Philadelphia in British hands, the Schuylkill River nearby, Valley Creek cutting through the landscape, and a defensible plateau near Mount Joy and Mount Misery, where Washington made a decision that was far more deliberate than a retreat into misery. The ground itself begins with a problem Washington could not wish away. Philadelphia was in British hands. In 1777, the city that had served as the American capital was occupied by the enemy, and that fact shaped every mile of the Continental Army's movement. Washington could not simply disappear into the interior and wait for spring. If he pulled too far back, the British would be free to move, forage, raid, and perhaps strike without being watched. But if he remained too close, his army could be trapped or forced into a battle on unfavorable terms. Valley Forge was chosen inside that narrow space between danger and necessity. It was not a flight into the wilderness. It was not the accidental stopping point of a broken army. It was a military position, selected because it solved several problems at once. The camp stood roughly a day's march from Philadelphia, close enough for Washington to keep pressure on British-occupied ground, close enough to watch for movement, but far enough to reduce the chance of a sudden blow that could destroy the army. Distance mattered. So did terrain. So did water. So did roads, approaches, and the ability to defend a large force through the winter. On a map, the choice has a cold logic. Philadelphia lay to the southeast. The Schuylkill River ran nearby. Valley Creek cut through the local landscape. The heights around Mount Joy and Mount Misery offered a naturally defensible plateau. These were not poetic names to the officers trying to preserve the army. They were features of ground that could be occupied, fortified, observed from, and defended. The Continental Army needed a place where it could survive without becoming irrelevant. That was the strategic tension. Washington had to remain near enough to the British to be a threat, but not so near that his own worn army became easy prey. Valley Forge gave him elevation, water access, and a position that could be strengthened. It allowed the army to settle into winter quarters while still standing between the British and the wider countryside. The phrase winter quarters can sound restful, almost domestic. But for an army, winter quarters were not simply shelter from weather. They were a temporary operating base. From such a camp, soldiers could guard roads, monitor enemy activity, send out patrols, maintain communications, gather intelligence, receive supplies, and prepare for future movement. The encampment had to protect the army not only from cold and hunger, but from strategic collapse. The British occupation of Philadelphia created a strange imbalance. The British held the city, but holding a city did not end the war. Washington's army still existed. Congress still existed beyond the city. The war still extended across farms, roads, river crossings, supply lines, and political loyalties. If Washington could preserve his army within reach of Philadelphia, British possession of the capital would remain incomplete. It would be a prize, but not a decision. That is why Valley Forge cannot be understood only as a symbol of suffering. Suffering came, and it came in force, but the site was chosen before the full winter ordeal had unfolded. The decision belongs first to strategy. Washington was positioning an army in relation to an enemy-held capital, a river system, a defensive landscape, and the uncertain supply network that would have to sustain thousands of people. The ground near Mount Joy and Mount Misery gave the army an advantage that open lowland could not. A plateau is not a wall, but it changes the terms of approach. An attacking force must climb, concentrate, and expose itself. Defenders can organize lines, place guards, and build earthworks with the terrain helping rather than hindering them. The later camp would include fortifications, but the choice of place came first. The land itself offered a beginning. The Schuylkill River mattered as well. Rivers in war are obstacles, highways, boundaries, and sources of movement. They shape the routes by which supplies can arrive and enemies can advance. To be near the Schuylkill was to be tied to a major feature of southeastern Pennsylvania's geography. Valley Creek, flowing through the area, added another local marker to the position. The Army's headquarters would later be associated with the Isaac Potts House near where Valley Creek flows into the Schuylkill River, but even before headquarters life took shape, the water and terrain were part of the military calculation. There was also the matter of watching. An army that cannot observe its enemy becomes blind. Washington did not need to sit at the gates of Philadelphia to keep the British under scrutiny, but he did need to remain close enough to respond if they moved. A day's march was not a casual distance. It preserved connection. It meant the British could not entirely ignore him. It meant their movements mattered to his scouts, and his presence mattered to their commanders. This was the geography of pressure. Washington could not force the British out of Philadelphia in the winter of 1777 simply by camping nearby. But he could deny them the comfort of believing the Continental Army had dissolved into the countryside. He could hold a defensible position. He could maintain a field army. He could make the occupation of the capital something less than victory. That distinction mattered deeply. In Revolutionary War, the survival of the army could be as important as the capture of cities. Philadelphia was a political and symbolic center, but the Continental Army was the instrument that kept the revolution alive as a military fact. If that army disappeared, the British occupation of Philadelphia would carry a different meaning. If the army endured nearby, the war remained unresolved. So the landscape around Valley Forge became a kind of answer. Not a comfortable answer. Not an abundant one. But an answer to a strategic dilemma. The army needed to rest and rebuild, yet still threaten. It needed defensive strength, yet also access to movement. It needed enough distance to avoid being crushed, yet enough proximity to remain relevant. Valley Forge offered those conditions better than a mere retreat would have. The name itself can mislead us now. Valley Forge has become inseparable from hunger, bare feet, smoke, disease, and snow. Memory has wrapped the place in hardship so tightly that the decision to go there can look like the beginning of a tragedy. But Washington and his officers were not choosing a legend. They were choosing terrain. They were reading the map after a hard campaign, after Philadelphia had fallen, with the army's future depending on where it could stand through the winter. A retreat, in the simplest sense, is movement away from danger. But Valley Forge was more complicated. It was a withdrawal from immediate exposure, yes, but also a forward presence. It was a camp close to the enemy capital. It was a shield for the countryside and a watchpost over British movements. It was a statement that the Continental Army, whatever its shortages, had not surrendered the field. The location also allowed a large encampment to take shape. That scale would soon become visible in huts, roads, fortifications, kitchens, livestock areas, hospitals, and command spaces. But before logs were cut and hut lines were marked, the army needed a site that could hold such a settlement without leaving it helpless. A winter camp of thousands was not a cluster of tents that could be hidden in a ravine. It was a temporary military city, and a city needed ground. The plateau near Mount Joy and Mount Misery gave that city room and protection. The nearby waterways gave it geographic orientation. The distance from Philadelphia gave it strategic purpose. Each element reinforced the others. None removed the hardships to come. Terrain could not bake bread. A river could not issue shoes. A defensible height could not cure fever. But without a defensible position, hunger and disease would not be the only threats. The army would also face the possibility of being surprised, cut off, or compelled into a disastrous fight. This is why the choice of Valley Forge deserves to be seen not as passive suffering, but as active military judgment. Washington was preserving options. He was keeping his army in being. He was balancing the loss of Philadelphia against the continued existence of a force that could still move when the season changed. The British had the city. Washington chose the ground. And once that ground was chosen, the army entered a landscape already marked by war. Valley Forge was not an empty name waiting for history. Before the soldiers built their huts there, the place had been a working village tied to iron, timber, milling, and trade. It had already seen British violence in the months before the encampment. The army was coming not to untouched wilderness, but to a damaged industrial site where a forge had once stood and where the traces of an earlier raid still shaped the meaning of the place. The ground Washington chose had already been wounded. Before the Continental Army came in December, before the lines of huts and the smoke of thousands of fires, Valley Forge had been a working place. Its name was not poetic at first. It was practical. It came from industry, from heat, from water power, from the hard labor of turning raw material into usable things. The valley held a village, and the village revolved around an iron forge. Around it were the structures that made such a place function: charcoal houses, a sawmill, a grist mill, and a company store. This matters because Valley Forge is often remembered as if the army entered a blank winter wilderness. In the national imagination, the scene can become stripped down to snow, hunger, bare feet, and endurance. But the real landscape was more complicated. It was not empty. It had roads, mills, buildings, work sites, and the remains of local economic life. It was part of a region where farms, waterways, timber, ironwork, and trade were tied together. By the time Washington selected it, that world had already been interrupted by the war. The forge gave the place its center of gravity. An iron forge was not just a single building with a fire inside it. It belonged to a chain of labor and supply. Charcoal had to be made and stored. Wood had to be cut. A sawmill turned timber into boards. A grist mill ground grain into flour or meal. A company store connected work to daily necessity, exchange, and credit. The village was small, but it was not isolated from the wider world. It was an industrial and agricultural node in the Pennsylvania countryside, close enough to Philadelphia to feel the pull of that city, and close enough to the Schuylkill River and Valley Creek to matter as ground and as a route. Then, the campaign of 1777 reached it. After the Battle of Brandywine in September, British forces moved through southeastern Pennsylvania in the struggle that would end with Philadelphia in British hands. In that movement, Valley Forge became a target. British troops raided the site, captured the forge, and burned it. Many village structures were burned as well. The fire that gave the place its name was answered by another kind of fire, not industrial, but military, the deliberate destruction of useful property in a landscape contested by armies. That September raid is essential to understanding the later winter encampment because it marks the difference between two very different kinds of history at the same site. Valley Forge did see violence before the famous winter. There was a small skirmish connected to the British raid, but the winter encampment itself was not a battlefield. The great drama that made the place famous did not come from lines of soldiers firing across the snow. The only fighting at the site belonged to that earlier September moment when British troops moved against the village and its forge. So when we say that no battle took place at Valley Forge during the encampment, that statement needs precision. It does not mean the ground had never heard gunfire. It means the famous winter story is not a battle story. The skirmish belonged to the campaign before the camp. The encampment belonged to another ordeal: supply, disease, exposure, discipline, and the effort to hold an army together within reach of an enemy-held capital. The burned forge also changes the emotional texture of the scene. When Washington's army later came to the area, the soldiers were not moving into a thriving village ready to support them. They were entering a damaged place. The destruction of the forge and many structures meant that the local landscape already carried signs of military pressure. Buildings that might once have suggested labor and commerce now suggested vulnerability. A village that had processed iron, grain, timber, and goods had been pulled into the logic of war. In a war like this, a forge could matter beyond its local importance. Iron, tools, hardware, and manufactured goods were part of the material world armies depended on. A sawmill and grist mill also mattered, because wood and grain were never abstract supplies. They were shelter, fuel, boards, flour, and the possibility of feeding and housing people. A company store mattered because it was part of how people in such a village obtained necessities. To strike a place like Valley Forge was to damage more than buildings. It was to interrupt the systems that made daily life and military support possible. The British raid also revealed the harsh geography of the Philadelphia campaign. The countryside outside the occupied city was not safely American simply because it was beyond the city streets. It was a zone of movement, scouting, foraging, raiding, and uncertainty. Armies did not only meet in formal battle, they pressed against mills, crossroads, stores, barns, and industrial sites. They took or destroyed what could serve the enemy. They left behind fear, absence, and smoke. By December, the ruins and surviving features of Valley Forge stood inside Washington's calculation. The plateau near Mount Joy and Mount Misery offered defensive advantages. The Schuylkill River and Valley Creek helped define the setting. Philadelphia was near enough to watch, but the army could not simply stand exposed before British power. The choice of ground belonged to strategy. But the condition of the ground belonged to recent memory. The army arrived at a place where the war had already passed through. There is a quiet irony in the name. Valley Forge became the place where the Continental Army itself was tested, hardened, and reshaped in memory. But before that metaphor attached itself to soldiers, the name belonged to an actual forge, to heat and hammering, to charcoal and iron. Then that forge was burned. When the army came later, it did not come to a symbol. It came to a site where the literal forge had been damaged and where a different kind of forging would begin, under conditions no one would have chosen. The village landscape also helps us see the army's arrival more clearly. The soldiers were not entering a neat camp already prepared for them. They were coming into terrain that had to be used, divided, defended, and reorganized. Existing features mattered, but they were not enough. A ruined or damaged village could not shelter more than 12,000 soldiers. A few mills and roads could not by themselves feed, house, and manage the human mass that was about to descend on the area. The encampment would have to be made. That making would be physical before it was symbolic. Trees would have to become walls. Mud would become roads and parade grounds. Slopes would become defensive lines. The countryside would be transformed into a temporary military city, not because the land invited comfort, but because survival required organization. Valley Forge's earlier industrial life had depended on coordinated labor. The Army's life would depend on something similar, but on a far larger and more desperate scale. The September raid gives the place a first layer of wartime meaning. It reminds us that British power had already reached into the valley before Washington's troops settled there. It also prevents a false picture of the winter as a siege or a battle fought on that ground. The British did not storm the camp in December. The Continental Army did not win fame there by defeating an assault. Its enemy in the coming months would be less visible and more relentless. Empty wagons, failed rations, cold huts, sickness, poor clothing, and the strain of waiting while the war continued around them. So the story of Valley Forge begins before the Army's arrival, not with snow, but with industry and fire. A forge, charcoal houses, a sawmill, a grist mill, a company store. Then September. British troops. A raid after Brandywine. The forge captured and burned. Village structures destroyed. A small skirmish, brief compared with the long memory that would follow. By the time Washington's columns approached in December, the place had already changed once. It had gone from working village to damaged wartime ground. Now, it was about to change again. On December 19th, 1777, the Continental Army would enter Valley Forge, not as visitors to a village, and not as soldiers preparing for a battlefield charge, but as the population of a new and improvised city. The forge had burned before they came. What remained was the ground, the water, the hills, the roads, and the urgent need to turn exposure into shelter before winter could finish what the British had not. The forge had burned before they came, but the ground remained. That was what the Army inherited on December 19th, 1777, not a finished refuge, not a prepared barracks, not a winter town waiting with doors open and chimneys warm. Valley Forge offered terrain, water, distance, and defensive possibility. It offered the Schuylkill River, Valley Creek, the high ground near Mount Joy and Mount Misery, and the remains of a place already touched by war. What it did not offer was shelter for thousands. So the arrival was not the end of a march. It was the beginning of a construction problem on a military scale. The image is easy to shrink in memory. A few men in the snow, a few fires, a small cluster of tents under bare trees. But the army that came into Valley Forge was not a handful of survivors huddling in isolation. According to the National Park Service, more than 12,000 soldiers entered the encampment, joined by about 400 women and children. That number matters because it changes the shape of the story. Valley Forge was not simply a campsite. It was the sudden beginning of an enormous temporary settlement, a military city that had to be planned while it was being occupied, built while it was already needed, and supplied before its systems were fully in place. The men arrived after a year of hard campaigning. Philadelphia was occupied by the British. Washington's army had chosen this position because it needed to remain near enough to watch the enemy, but strong enough to avoid being destroyed. That choice now had consequences measured in acres, axes, firewood, food, guard posts, roads, latrines, kitchens, hospitals, and lines of command. A defensible plateau was not the same thing as a livable camp. On December 19th, the Continental Army entered a landscape that could help protect it from British attack, but only if the army could first organize itself against cold, exposure, hunger, disease, and disorder. Every winter army faced a basic question. How do you stop movement without letting the force fall apart? On campaign, motion creates its own kind of order. Columns march. Units follow roads. Officers issue commands for the day's movement. Wagons creak forward. Men sleep where they are told, rise when ordered, and move again. But an encampment is different. Once thousands of people stop in one place, the dangers change. Crowding becomes a threat. Waste becomes a threat. Fire becomes a threat. Confusion becomes a threat. A camp has to be shaped before it can function. If it remains only a mass of tired bodies and scattered gear, it can decay faster than an army on the road. At Valley Forge, the first task was to impose form. Regiments had to be assigned ground. Officers had to know where their men were. Men had to know where to report, where to cook, where to sleep, where to draw supplies if supplies arrived, and where to stand if the alarm was sounded. The army had to arrange itself so that it remained an army, not merely a crowd. The placement of units was not decorative. It was the skeleton of discipline. A camp that could not locate its soldiers could not feed them, command them, or defend them. And this was not a population made up only of enlisted men. The presence of hundreds of women and children reminds us that the 18th century army carried a larger world with it. These women and children were part of the army's daily life, attached to its movement, its labor, and its survival. They shared the risks of distance, weather, shortage, and disease. Their presence turns the encampment from a purely military diagram into something more human and more complicated, a place where military necessity and household survival overlapped. For the soldiers, the immediate problem was shelter. Not comfort, shelter. A tent might serve for a night or a campaign halt, but it could not be the foundation of a 6-month winter encampment for more than 12,000 soldiers. The army needed walls. It needed roofs. It needed places where men could sleep off the ground, where fires could be controlled, where units could be housed in some relationship to command. Before the great memory of Valley Forge could become a story of endurance, there had to be a practical act of transformation. Exposed ground had to become a built environment. That transformation began under pressure. December was already deep enough into the season for the problem to be urgent. The army was not preparing for winter in the abstract. Winter had arrived with it. Every delay mattered. Every day without adequate shelter exposed soldiers to cold and sickness. Every shortage of tools made the work slower. Every weakness in supply turned labor into hardship. Men who needed to build huts also needed food, clothing, shoes, blankets, and strength. If those things were missing or inadequate, construction itself became harder, and the camp's future became less secure. This is one reason Valley Forge must be understood as a test of organization as much as suffering. Misery alone does not explain survival. Armies do not endure because people are cold. They endure when command, labor, discipline, and improvisation turn hardship into systems. The Continental Army's first days at Valley Forge demanded exactly that. The army had to create order while surrounded by uncertainty. It had to make a settlement before it had the full benefits of one. The geography that had made Valley Forge useful now had to be translated into daily life. The Schuylkill River and Valley Creek were not only features on a map. They shaped movement, access, and the arrangement of the encampment. The high ground near Mount Joy and Mount Misery was not only defensible terrain. It was also the stage on which thousands of people had to live. The same hills and slopes that offered security had to be crossed by men carrying wood, tools, water, food, and equipment. Strategic ground had to become working ground. The army's arrival also brought noise into a damaged landscape. The earlier Forge village had known the sound of industry, water power, ironwork, milling, wagons, labor. Then British troops had raided the place, burned the forge, and left destruction behind. Now another kind of industrial sound began to rise. Axes striking timber. Orders passed down lines. Wagons moving over frozen or rutted roads. Men clearing ground. Fires being kindled. Animals driven and managed. Camp life beginning before the camp was truly made. It is important not to imagine this as neat from the first hour. Temporary cities are born in disorder. Men arrive tired. Units arrive at different moments. Officers try to translate plans into ground. Supplies lag behind needs. The work of one department depends on another. Food distribution depends on transport and procurement. Shelter depends on tools, timber, labor, and command. Health depends on space, sanitation, clothing, nutrition, and medical care. Even before the worst weeks of hunger and sickness, the structure of the crisis was already visible. Every part of the army depended on every other part. Washington's challenge was not only to face the British in Philadelphia, it was to prevent his own army from dissolving under the weight of winter administration. An army can be brave and still fail if it cannot eat. It can be loyal and still become ineffective if too many soldiers are barefoot, sick, or exposed. It can hold a strong position and still suffer if that position cannot be made habitable. Valley Forge forced these truths into the open. On December 19th, the Continental Army crossed a threshold. Before that day, Valley Forge was a chosen position, a damaged industrial site, a defensible landscape. After that day, it became a living problem. More than 12,000 soldiers and hundreds of women and children had to be absorbed into a place without the built capacity to receive them. The encampment began as an act of occupation, but it could survive only by becoming an act of construction. The word camp can make the place sound temporary in a simple way, as if temporary meant light, small, or easily moved. Valley Forge was temporary, but it was not small. It would need streets of huts, guarded approaches, supply routines, headquarters, work details, hospitals, storage, kitchens, and defensive works. It would need boundaries and habits. It would need rules. Above all, it would need shelter and quantity. The arrival, then, was not a dramatic pause before the real story. It was the first crisis of the encampment. The army had come to ground it could defend, but now it had to build the means to remain there. In the cold opening days, survival began with the simplest materials and the hardest labor: timber cut from the landscape, logs shaped into walls, roofs raised against weather, and lines of huts turning the exposed plateau into something like a city. Before Valley Forge could become a symbol, it had to become habitable, and that work would soon be counted not in a few shelters, but in more than 1,500 huts. The work that began with exposure soon became architecture. Not architecture in the polished sense, not buildings meant to last for generations, but the rough, urgent architecture of an army that had to survive long enough to fight again. At Valley Forge, shelter was not separate from strategy. A hut was not just a place to sleep. A line of huts was order. A brigade street was discipline. A roof over sick or hungry men was a claim that the army still existed. The Continental Army did not arrive at Valley Forge and simply scatter across the ground. It had to make a settlement that could be commanded. Thousands of soldiers, with women and children among them, had entered a landscape of hills, streams, roads, and damaged industry. Now the army began to impose a military pattern on that landscape. It cut timber. It raised walls. It marked spaces. It turned a defensible plateau into a temporary military city. The scale matters. According to the National Park Service, the encampment included more than 1,500 log huts. That number changes the image of Valley Forge. It was not a few tents shivering under bare trees. It was not merely a symbolic winter scene, reduced to snow, footprints, and suffering. It was a built environment, assembled under pressure by men who were already strained by shortages, cold, fatigue, and uncertainty. Each hut represented labor before comfort. Trees had to be felled and dragged. Logs had to be notched, stacked, and fitted into walls. Roofs had to be made to shed weather as best they could. Openings had to be left for doors, smoke, and movement. The finished huts were rough, but their purpose was precise. They gave the army a way to endure without dissolving into scattered campfires and makeshift shelters. They made it possible to assign men to places, to find units, to enforce routines, to distribute supplies when supplies existed, and to maintain the chain of command. In a camp this large, building shelter also meant building visibility. Officers needed to know where men were. Messengers needed routes. Guards needed posts. Work details needed to be organized. Sick men needed to be separated, treated, or moved. Food, tools, firewood, animals, ammunition, and paperwork all needed places within a camp that was constantly being shaped by weather and want. The huts were therefore part of a larger system. They were the rooms of a city whose government was military necessity. The Army's construction project did not end with shelter. Valley Forge also required defense. The camp's location had been chosen because it offered a strong position, but terrain alone did not defend an army. A plateau near Mount Joy and Mount Misery gave Washington advantages. The Schuylkill River and Valley Creek shaped movement and access. Distance from Philadelphia helped keep the army close enough to observe the British, but not so close that it could be easily overwhelmed. Still, every advantage had to be improved by human labor. Around the encampment, the army built roughly 2 miles of fortifications. These included 5 earthen redoubts. A redoubt was not glamorous. It was earth moved by hand, shaped into a defensive work, meant to protect men and guns and to control approaches. But in that plain earthwork was a clear military statement. The army was not merely hiding in winter quarters. It was holding a position. The fortifications at Valley Forge reveal a quieter form of combat preparation. No major battle would take place there during the winter encampment, but the camp still had to be ready for one. British forces remained in Philadelphia. Washington could not assume that hunger and cold would be the only enemies. He had to prepare for attack, surprise, reconnaissance, and pressure. The redoubts and defensive lines helped turn the encampment from a vulnerable crowd into a protected military post. This is one of the central contradictions of Valley Forge. It is remembered for suffering, but suffering alone did not define it. If the army had only suffered, it might have vanished. What gives the site its deeper significance is that the soldiers suffered while continuing to organize. They built while hungry. They fortified while poorly clothed. They created roads, lines, huts, posts, and barriers, while the machinery of supply strained and often failed around them. The work of construction was itself a form of resistance to collapse. The camp had to defend against the British, but it also had to defend against disorder. A military city cannot function if movement is random. It needs access, crossings, routes, and control points. At Valley Forge, one striking example was the bridge over the Schuylkill River. According to the National Park Service, the Army constructed a bridge there based on a Roman design. That detail reaches backward across centuries. In the middle of an American Revolutionary winter, an army fighting for survival drew on an older engineering tradition. A Roman-style bridge over the Schuylkill was not simply a convenience. It was a piece of military infrastructure. Rivers divide armies from resources, from roads, from intelligence, from retreat, and from pursuit. A bridge turns separation into connection. It makes movement possible where water would otherwise slow or stop it. The Schuylkill mattered because Valley Forge was not an isolated hollow. It was tied to the geography of the war. Philadelphia lay within reach. Roads and waterways connected farms, markets, depots, headquarters, patrols, and enemy movements. The Army's ability to cross and move mattered every day, even when no battle line formed. A bridge could help troops, wagons, animals, supplies, and messengers move through the military landscape more reliably. It also reflected a basic truth of encampment life. Survival depended not only on what could be built in place, but on what could move in and out. The same was true of the huts and fortifications. They were fixed objects, but their purpose was to support movement. Men moved from quarters to guard posts, from guard posts to work details, from work details to roads, hospitals, kitchens, headquarters, and defensive lines. Orders moved from Washington's command structure into the camp. Reports moved back again. Supplies moved when the systems behind them worked. Sickness moved too, through crowded quarters and strained medical arrangements. The camp was never still. Its buildings and earthworks were the framework through which all of this motion passed. Seen this way, Valley Forge was not a pause in the war. It was a war room spread across hillsides and timberlines. Decisions became physical. A choice of ground became a defensive perimeter. A need for shelter became more than 1,500 log huts. A vulnerable approach became an earthen redoubt. A river crossing became a bridge shaped by engineering memory. The camp was a map made solid. The men who built it were not working under ideal conditions. They had not entered a prepared winter base. They had arrived in December after a hard campaign season, while the British held Philadelphia and while the Continental Army supply systems struggled to keep pace with need. The work demanded tools, strength, time, and organization. Every log wall testified not only to manpower, but to command. Someone had to assign the work. Someone had to direct where units would live. Someone had to think in terms of defense, sanitation, movement, and proximity, even when immediate suffering pressed in from every side. That is why the physical camp should not be treated as background scenery. It was one of Washington's first answers to the crisis. He could not instantly solve the shortages of food, shoes, blankets, transport, medicines, or clothing. He could not remove the British from Philadelphia simply by taking winter quarters. But he could keep the army together on defensible ground. He could make the camp legible. He could insist that the soldiers remain part of a common military structure rather than becoming isolated survivors. There is a discipline in building under hardship. A man cutting timber for a hut is not marching into battle, but he is still serving the army's future. A unit raising walls together is also rehearsing obedience, cooperation, and endurance. A defensive line dug in cold earth says that the army intends to be attacked and intends to answer. The work may be slow and repetitive, but it carries an emotional force. It says, "We are still here, and we are preparing to remain." The completed encampment would never be comfortable in the way civilian memory might imagine a town. It remained crowded, cold, smoky, dirty, and vulnerable to disease. Its huts could not erase hunger. Its redoubts could not clothe the barefoot. Its bridge could not guarantee that wagons would arrive full. But without those huts, redoubts, roads, and crossings, the crisis would have been worse. The army needed a body before it could heal, train, or march. Valley Forge's built environment gave that body shape. By the time the lines of huts had spread across the ground and the fortifications had begun to define the perimeter, the encampment had become something larger than a refuge. It was a constructed argument against disintegration. It showed that the Continental Army still possessed enough discipline to build, enough command to organize, and enough strategic purpose to hold a position within reach of the enemy. Yet the walls could only do so much. A roof could protect a soldier from weather, but it could not fill his stomach. A redoubt could guard an approach, but it could not make bread appear. The camp had been made habitable by labor, but habitability was not the same as sustenance. Inside those more than 1,500 huts, the next measure of survival would be counted in rations promised, rations missing, and the painful distance between what existed on paper and what reached the men. A roof could hold off rain and snow, and a wall of logs could soften the wind. But a hut did not answer the oldest question in any army: what will the men eat tomorrow? At Valley Forge, hunger was not simply the absence of food. It was the distance between an army as it was imagined in regulations and an army as it existed on frozen ground. On paper, the Continental soldier had a ration. It could be described, measured, repeated, and inspected. It had weights, quantities, and categories. It gave the appearance of a system. The promised daily ration during the encampment was substantial. A soldier was to receive 1 1/2 pounds of bread. He was to receive 1 pound of beef or fish, or 3/4 of a pound of pork. There were to be spirits or beer. There were to be peas or beans and milk. Each week, there were to be issues of butter, vinegar, and soap. Read as a list, it sounds almost orderly. Bread, meat, drink, legumes, milk, butter, vinegar, soap. It was not luxury. It was the basic fuel of military life. Bread to fill the body. Meat for strength. Peas or beans to stretch the meal. Spirits or beer as part of 18th century military rationing. Vinegar and soap not merely as comforts, but as tools in a crowded camp where health could decline quickly. The ration was a promise that the army understood the needs of the men who carried its muskets. But Valley Forge was where promises had to travel. They had to travel through the commissary department, through purchasing agents, through packers, wagons, drovers, roads, weather, prices, local markets, military demands, and political decisions. They had to move from farm to storehouse, from storehouse to camp, from camp distribution to the hands and mouths of soldiers. A ration was not real because it was written down. It became real only when flour arrived, when cattle were driven in, when meat could be issued, when bread could be made, when a man standing in line received what the rules said he was owed. That was the brutal gap at Valley Forge. The ration existed. The machinery to deliver it often failed. The scale of the problem can be difficult to hold in the mind. This was not a household short of a meal. It was a temporary military city of more than 12,000 soldiers, with women and children also living inside the army's world. Every day required a flow of food large enough to sustain regiments, brigades, guards, work parties, hospitals, headquarters staff, and all the labor that made the camp function. Men building huts needed food. Men cutting timber needed food. Men posted at defenses needed food. Men too sick to stand needed food of some kind. The army did not merely eat between military tasks. Eating made those tasks possible. Records cited by the National Park Service show that from December 1777 to February 1778, more than 2,225,000 pounds of beef were issued in camp, along with 2,974,000 pounds of flour and 500,000 gills of rum and whiskey. Those figures matter because they complicate the simpler image of Valley Forge as a place where nothing arrived at all. Food did come in. Meat was issued. Flour was issued. Spirits were issued. The camp was not an empty wilderness, disconnected from supply. And still, the men went hungry. That is the essential contradiction. Enormous quantities could pass through the army and still fail to meet daily need. A large number on a ledger did not guarantee a full ration in a hut. Supplies might arrive unevenly, too late, in the wrong form, in insufficient amount, or without the transport needed to move them to the places where they were required. The army could be fed in records and underfed in lived experience at the same time. The official ration list becomes, for that reason, one of the most revealing documents of the encampment. It shows that the Continental Army was not indifferent to the feeding of its men. It had standards. It had expectations. It had a language of entitlement and obligation. A soldier could know what he was supposed to receive. Officers could know what was missing. Commanders could point to the gap between regulation and reality and call it failure, not fate. But to the soldier in a hut, the missing part of the ration was not an administrative abstraction. It was the day's weakness. It was the empty interval before duty. It was the smell of smoke without enough food over the fire. It was flour not yet delivered, meat not yet issued, cattle not yet arrived, bread not yet baked. It was the knowledge that somewhere in a chain of responsibility, stretching beyond the camp, something had broken down. The worst supply crisis came in early to mid-February 1778. By then, Valley Forge was no longer in its first days of improvisation. The huts had risen. The lines of the camp had taken shape. The army had endured the first shock of arrival and exposure. But the deeper test of remaining in place had become clear. An army could build a city of huts and still be threatened by the failure of its stomach. Early to mid-February was not dramatic because of a battlefield charge or a sudden British assault on the encampment. Its drama was quieter and more corrosive. It was the crisis of a system unable to make the official ration dependable. Men who were already facing cold, poor clothing, and disease could not be expected to maintain strength on promises. Hunger worked against discipline. It worked against morale. It made every order heavier. It turned routine labor into punishment. It made the distance from Valley Forge to British-occupied Philadelphia feel both strategically necessary and materially painful. This is why food at Valley Forge cannot be treated as a background detail. It was not scenery. It was power. It was organization. It was the physical basis of obedience. In an 18th century army, the ration was one of the bonds between a soldier and the cause he served. Pay might be delayed. Clothing might be poor. Shelter might be rough. But the daily ration was supposed to make service bearable enough to continue. When that ration failed, the army did not merely suffer. It was tested at the point where loyalty met the body. The list itself also reveals how broad the idea of supply had to be. Bread required flour, milling, transport, and preparation. Beef required cattle, drovers, slaughtering, preservation, and distribution. Pork required procurement and storage. Fish depended on availability and movement. Peas and beans needed purchase and delivery. Milk required local access and reliable handling. Butter, vinegar, and soap required their own lines of supply. Even spirits or beer, so routine in the ration language of the period, demanded containers, transport, issue, and accounting. Nothing in that list was simple once multiplied across an army. A pound of meat was not just a pound of meat. It was an animal purchased somewhere, driven somewhere, guarded somewhere, processed somewhere, and issued somewhere. 1½ pounds of bread was not just bread. It was grain, flour, wagons, roads, mills, storage, ovens, and time. The ration looked compact when written, but behind it stood a hidden geography of farms, rivers, storehouses, officials, contractors, and roads leading toward the Schuylkill and the encampment near Valley Creek. Valley Forge exposed the fragility of that geography. The camp sat in a defensible position, close enough to watch the British in Philadelphia, but the same strategic placement did not automatically solve the problem of provisioning and yak promotion. Military geography and supply geography overlapped, but they were not the same. A position could be well chosen for defense and still difficult to feed. A plateau could be strong against attack and vulnerable to empty wagons. In the huts, soldiers lived with that contradiction. The army had built shelter in visible form: logs, chimneys, roads, hut lines. Food, by contrast, depended on movement from outside the visible camp. A soldier could see the roof over him. He could touch the wall beside him. But the day's ration depended on decisions and failures beyond his sight. That uncertainty shaped the emotional weather of Valley Forge. Hunger made the camp feel unstable, even when its walls stood firm. It forced Washington and his officers to confront a hard truth: endurance could not be commanded indefinitely if the means of endurance did not arrive. Men might accept hardship for a cause, but no cause erased the body's need for bread. The ration on paper therefore becomes more than a menu. It is evidence of the Army's ambition to act like a real institution. It wanted to feed men by rule, not by chance. It wanted to measure obligation and make survival routine. Yet Valley Forge showed that rules alone did not feed an army. Institutions had to function. Departments had to procure. Wagons had to move. Supplies had to arrive before hunger became disorder. By February, that lesson had become severe. The Continental Army had not collapsed, but the danger was no longer theoretical. Inside the encampment, the difference between an army and a starving crowd could narrow with frightening speed. The official ration proved what the soldiers were owed. The empty portions proved what the system could not yet guarantee. And this was the crisis that moved from the huts to the highest levels of command. Hunger was not only a private suffering shared by thousands of men. It became a warning about the Army's future. If the machinery of supply could not be repaired, Valley Forge might not remain a story of endurance. It could become a place where the Army thinned, scattered, or broke. Before long, Washington would put that danger into words for Congress, and the words would be as stark as the winter itself: starvation, dissolution, or dispersal. The phrase did not come out of legend. It came out of administration. Starvation, dissolution, or dispersal was not a campfire exaggeration, not a later memory polished into drama. It was the kind of language a commander used when the ordinary machinery of an army had failed so badly that its failure had become strategic. George Washington was not only describing hunger at Valley Forge. He was warning Congress that hunger could undo the Army itself. On December 23, 1777, only days after the Continental Army entered Valley Forge, Washington wrote with a clarity that cut through any comforting idea of winter quarters. The Army had found its ground. It had begun the enormous work of shelter. It remained within reach of British-occupied Philadelphia, but none of that solved the basic problem that every army carries with it: men must be fed, clothed, and kept in condition to obey orders. Washington's warning turned on a system, not a single empty storehouse. Unless the commissary system changed, he told Congress, the Army might be reduced to starvation, dissolution, or dispersal. Each word carried a different kind of ruin. Starvation meant the slow, physical weakening of the force. It meant men who could not march, could not stand guard, could not build, could not fight. Dissolution meant the Army coming apart as an institution, discipline eroded by want, confidence broken by the feeling that no one could provide what service required. Dispersal meant something equally dangerous: men scattering, units thinning, soldiers seeking survival away from the camp because the camp could no longer sustain them. This was the terror beneath the winter story. Valley Forge was not simply a place where men suffered. It was a place where suffering threatened to become organizational collapse. At the center of that danger was the commissary department. Its responsibilities sound plain when reduced to a list: purchasing, packing, and distributing rations to the Continental Army. But in those three actions lay the difference between an army that could remain in the field and one that could not. Purchasing meant finding food in a war zone and in a strained economy. The army needed bread, flour, meat, and other provisions not in symbolic quantities, but in amounts large enough to support thousands of soldiers day after day. Packing meant making those supplies movable and usable, turning scattered food into military stores. Distribution meant getting those stores from wherever they were gathered to the men who needed them, through roads, weather, shortages of transport, administrative confusion, and the constant pressure of distance. If any one part failed, the whole chain weakened. Food that was never purchased could not be packed. Food that was packed but not moved might as well have been imaginary to the soldiers in their huts. Food that arrived late, spoiled, or in insufficient quantity did not merely inconvenience the army. It hollowed it out from within. This is why Washington's warning to Congress mattered so much. He was not asking for sympathy alone. He was pointing to the structure that made military endurance possible. The Continental Army did not live by courage alone, or by patriotism alone, or by the memory of battles already fought. It lived by systems. Those systems were human, improvised, political, and often fragile. At Valley Forge, the men could build huts with their own hands. They could cut timber, shape logs, and raise roofs. They could dig works and hold lines, but they could not, by personal discipline alone, create a functioning supply network. Hunger exposed the limits of individual endurance. It forced the question upward, toward departments, officials, purchasing agents, Congress, and the uneasy relationship between military need and civilian authority. The official ration had already shown the problem in outline. The soldier was supposed to receive a daily allotment: bread, meat or fish, peas or beans, milk, spirits or beer, with weekly issues of butter, vinegar, and soap. The list gave the army a standard. But a standard was not a meal. Regulations did not fill kettles. A ration existed only when the department responsible for it could turn promises into deliveries. Washington's December letter made clear that this was not an abstract complaint. The danger had already entered the camp. Corpsmen and rerum were covetably. Men who did not receive food weakened. Men who weakened became unfit for duty. Men unfit for duty reduced the army's strength even before a shot was fired. And food was only part of the visible failure. In the same grim season, Washington cited a field report that recorded 2,898 men unfit for duty because they were barefoot or otherwise inadequately clothed. That number is not just a measure of discomfort. It is a military fact. An army can carry thousands of names on its rolls and still lose a large part of its usable strength. A soldier without shoes is not simply unhappy. He may be unable to march. He may be unable to stand a post in freezing conditions. He may be unable to move quickly if alarm sounds in the night. A soldier without adequate clothing becomes vulnerable to cold, illness, exhaustion, and despair. In a winter encampment, the line between clothing and survival was thin. The report's number, 2,898, gives the crisis a hard edge. These were not imagined losses. They were men present in the army, but not fully available to it, bodies counted yet diminished by want. Their condition revealed that supply failure did not wait for battle to produce casualties. It could remove men from duty while they were still inside the lines. Washington understood that the army's enemies were not only across the countryside in British-occupied Philadelphia. There was another kind of enemy moving through the camp: shortage, delay, weakness, administrative breakdown. It entered through empty wagons and missing shoes. It appeared in huts where men waited for provisions. It showed up in returns, reports, and the worsening arithmetic of who could still serve. This was why the word dispersal mattered. If soldiers believed the army could not feed or clothe them, if they watched men become useless from hunger and exposure, the camp's order itself could be threatened. In 18th century warfare, as in any war, an army was a moral organism as well as a physical one. Men endured hardship when they believed hardship had purpose, when command could still command, when suffering seemed temporary rather than endless. But when supply failed again and again, authority itself began to look fragile. The Valley Forge encampment was therefore a test of trust. The soldiers had to trust that remaining with the army was not the same as surrendering themselves to neglect. Washington had to trust that Congress and the supply departments could respond before suffering became irreversible. Congress had to understand that the army was not a fixed object sitting safely in winter quarters, but a living force that required constant feeding, clothing, and movement of supplies. The commissary department stood directly in that pressure. It was supposed to connect the larger cause of independence to the daily ration in a soldier's hand. That connection was practical, but it was also political. A revolution that could not feed its army risked losing the instrument by which the revolution defended itself. This is the deeper meaning of Washington's December 23rd warning. Valley Forge was not yet the worst moment of the food crisis. The most severe shortages would come later, in early to mid-February 1778. But Washington already saw the direction of the danger. He recognized that a failing commissary system could turn winter quarters into a place of disintegration. The army did not have to be defeated in open battle to be destroyed. It could be reduced slowly by cold feet and empty stomachs, by missing wagons and delayed flour, by cattle not brought forward, by officials unable to make a vast and scattered supply effort work. It could be undone by the gap between what the nation expected from its soldiers and what the nation managed to provide them. And yet the warning itself was also an act of command. Washington did not merely describe collapse. He named it in time to demand action. By putting starvation, dissolution, and dispersal before Congress, he transformed the misery of the camp into a matter of national survival. The hunger in the huts became evidence in a larger argument. If the Continental Army was to remain an army, supply had to be treated as war work. Behind the visible encampment, behind the log huts and frozen roads and watch posts facing the occupied capital, another struggle was taking shape. It involved commissaries, purchasers, deputies, cattle, flour, transport, resignations, appointments, and a chain of responsibility that stretched far beyond Valley Forge. The fight to keep the army alive would not be fought with muskets alone. It would be fought through the hidden machinery of logistics, where every missing ration could become a military danger, and every successful delivery could help hold the army together. Behind Washington's warning was a quieter map of the war, not the map of redoubts and ridgelines, but the map of roads, farms, mills, storehouses, river crossings, droves of cattle, and men with authority to buy what an army needed before it disappeared into other hands. Valley Forge was close enough to British-occupied Philadelphia to watch the enemy, but the nearness also sharpened the supply contest. Every pound of flour, every animal driven toward camp, every barrel or sack that could be packed and moved belonged to a second battlefield. This was the supply war behind the war. The commissary department stood at the center of it. Its task sounded plain when reduced to a sentence: purchase, pack, and distribute rations to the Continental Army. But at Valley Forge, that sentence opened into a maze. Food had to be found before it could be issued. It had to be bought in a country strained by inflation, fear, divided loyalties, military demand, and the presence of British forces in the region. It had to be collected from farms and markets, gathered into usable quantities, moved over winter roads, protected from delay and loss, and finally distributed inside a camp that had grown into a temporary military city. In the huts, the failure of that system was felt as hunger. At headquarters, it appeared as reports, letters, shortages, competing demands, and the possibility that the army itself might come apart. The men who handled supply rarely occupy the center of the Valley Forge story, but their work shaped the daily reality of the camp as surely as any order of march. The names form a less familiar roster of the Revolution: William Buchanan, Jeremiah Wadsworth, Charles Stewart, Ephraim Blaine, Peter Colt, Jacob Cuyler, William Aylett, and Thomas Jones. They were part of the machinery that tried to turn civilian food into military survival. During much of the Valley Forge crisis, William Buchanan served as Commissary General of Purchases. That title placed him in one of the most exposed positions in the Army's administrative world. The soldiers did not see a title when they lacked bread or meat. They saw absence. Officers did not judge a supply officer by intent, but by whether the ration reached the line. Congress in Washington, looking at the same crisis from different seats of responsibility, saw the commissary department as both necessary and deeply troubled. Buchanan's office was supposed to help feed the army, but the winter exposed how fragile that system had become. To understand Buchanan's burden, it helps to imagine the distance between decision and delivery. An order in a ledger was not a meal. A purchase agreement was not bread in a soldier's hand. A herd of cattle existed as military supply only if it could be gathered, driven, guarded, slaughtered, and issued. Flour had value only if it could move from mills and stores toward the camp. Even when food existed somewhere in the countryside, it did not automatically belong to the army. It had to pass through people, paperwork, wagons, roads, weather, and time. At Valley Forge, time was often the enemy. A shortage that might have looked temporary in an office could become desperate in a hut. The worst supply crisis in early to mid-February 1778 showed how quickly the gap between system and survival could widen. Earlier chapters have followed that gap through the ration promised on paper and the warning Washington sent to Congress. Here, the same crisis can be seen from the other side, as a contest to make a young nation's administrative structure strong enough to sustain an army in the field. The commissary department was not one man alone. It depended on a chain of personnel spread across departments, regions, and specialized duties. Charles Stewart belonged to this world of supply administration. So did Peter Colt, Jacob Cuyler, William Aylett, and Thomas Jones. Their names remind us that feeding an army was not a single heroic act, but a dispersed labor of agents and deputies, each tied to particular responsibilities within a larger system. The Army's survival required many people to perform work that was essential precisely because it was often invisible when it succeeded. Among these men, Ephraim Blaine offers one of the clearest glimpses of the supply war in motion. Blaine served as deputy commissary of purchases for the Middle Department, and his work included gathering cattle and moving droves toward Valley Forge. The image is stark and practical. Cattle on the road, men urging them forward, the movement of living food across a landscape where delay could mean hunger. In a war remembered through bayonets, flags, and councils of command, a drove of cattle moving toward the Schuylkill could be as important as a regiment taking position. Cattle were not simply supplies. They were mobile, perishable, vulnerable assets. They needed handlers. They needed routes. They moved at the pace of animals, not at the speed of need. They had to arrive in a condition that made them useful. A successful drove represented coordination across distance. It meant that someone had identified the animals, secured them, assembled them, and started them toward the camp. It meant that the supply system, strained as it was, had not completely failed. That mattered because the Continental Army at Valley Forge did not need occasional charity. It needed repeatable supply. More than 12,000 soldiers had entered the encampment, along with hundreds of women and children who were part of the Army's world. A single delivery could relieve suffering for a moment, but only a functioning system could keep the Army alive through a winter and into a campaign season. The commissary department's work had to be continuous. It had to make the next day possible, and then the day after that. The pressure on Buchanan did not ease. In March 1778, he resigned. The resignation came after months in which the supply crisis had become one of the central facts of the encampment. His departure did not by itself solve the problem, because the crisis was not merely personal. It was institutional. The Army needed stronger systems, clearer authority, better movement, and more reliable delivery. But a change in personnel signaled that the existing arrangement could not simply continue as before. In April 1778, Jeremiah Wadsworth became Commissary General of Purchases. His appointment belonged to the broader effort to repair the machinery that Washington had warned was failing. Wadsworth inherited not an abstract office, but a living emergency, an army that had survived the worst weeks of winter, yet still depended on food arriving through uncertain channels. By spring, the question was not only whether the army could endure Valley Forge, it was whether it could emerge from the encampment able to move, fight, and remain under command. The timing matters. Buchanan's resignation in March and Wadsworth's appointment in April came as the Army was beginning to move from the depths of winter toward the possibility of renewed campaigning. The crisis had revealed that battlefield strategy could not be separated from logistics. Washington could choose strong ground. Officers could organize huts and defenses. Soldiers could drill, stand watch, and remain loyal through hunger. But without food, no army could be kept in being for long. This is why the supply story at Valley Forge should not be treated as background. It was one of the central struggles of the encampment. The British Army occupied Philadelphia, but the Continental Army's immediate danger was not always a British attack. Sometimes it was the failure of flour to arrive. Sometimes it was the delay of meat. Sometimes it was the gap between officials responsible for purchasing food and the men waiting for it in camp. The revolution depended on armies, but armies depended on systems that were still being built under pressure. There is a temptation to imagine logistics as cold and clerical, a matter of ledgers detached from suffering. Valley Forge shows the opposite. Administration had a human temperature. When the commissary department faltered, men went hungry. When cattle moved toward camp, the prospect of survival moved with them. When officers argued over supply, they were arguing over whether the army could remain concentrated, disciplined, and ready. Every receipt, every purchase, every drove, every wagon that reached the encampment helped answer Washington's fear that the army might dissolve or scatter. Still, food was only one part of the material crisis. The same winter that exposed the weakness of the commissary system also exposed another kind of need. Soldiers required more than rations to remain soldiers. They needed shoes for frozen roads, blankets for the huts, tools for labor, wagons and teams for movement, clothing, uniforms, medicines, and the means to carry supplies from one place to another. The hidden battlefield of logistics did not end at the bread ration or the cattle drove. It widened into every object required to keep a body warm, a camp functioning, and an army capable of war. Food had been the most visible emergency because hunger announced itself quickly. It weakened a man in a day, hollowed him in a week, and could make discipline feel like an argument against the body itself. But Valley Forge was not held together by bread alone. An army also depended on leather, wool, iron, canvas, wood, medicine, rope, paper, wagons, horses, oxen, and the hands that could move all of it through winter roads. When those things failed, the camp did not simply become uncomfortable. It became less able to function as an army. The shortage of shoes was the most painful symbol of that wider crisis. Washington's correspondents had already carried the stark figure of 2,898 men unfit for duty because they were barefoot or otherwise inadequately clothed. That number was not only a measure of suffering, it was a measure of military capacity. A soldier without shoes could not easily march, stand guard, haul timber, dig earthworks, or move between outposts. Frozen ground turned every errand into punishment. Mud and ice did not distinguish between a private sent for firewood and a sentry assigned to watch the roads toward British-occupied Philadelphia. Without shoes, the map of the war shrank to what a damaged body could endure. Clothing had the same military meaning. A coat was not just a coat. A shirt was not just a shirt. Blankets were not only a comfort for sleep. In a camp of more than 12,000 soldiers, with hundreds of women and children also living inside the Army's world, warmth was part of survival, and survival was part of readiness. The log huts could protect men from open weather, but they did not erase winter. Inside them, soldiers still needed blankets. They needed clothing that could dry, or at least resist the damp. They needed something between skin and cold air, between an exhausted body and the dirt floor of a hut. This was the cruel arithmetic of material shortage. Hunger weakened the body. Lack of clothing exposed it. Lack of blankets denied it recovery. Lack of medicine left illness with fewer obstacles. Each deficiency made the next one worse. A poorly fed man was more vulnerable to cold. A cold man was less able to work. A man too weak to work slowed the building and maintenance of the camp. And a camp that could not maintain itself invited still more sickness, disorder, and misery. The huts themselves, so often remembered as evidence of endurance, also reveal the need for tools. More than 1,500 log huts did not rise from patriotic feeling alone. They required axes, saws, wedges, spades, and labor repeated across the whole encampment. Fortifications, too, demanded more than orders. The army built roughly 2 miles of works and 5 earthen redoubts. Earth had to be cut, carried, shaped, and reinforced. Timber had to be felled and moved. Roads and paths through the camp had to bear constant traffic. Even the bridge over the Schuylkill River, described by the National Park Service as based on a Roman design, belonged to this world of practical military engineering. The army could plan a defensive position, but without tools and transport, plans became delays. Every shortage slowed time. A task that should have taken an hour might take a day if men lacked proper implements. A load that should have moved by wagon might have to wait because animals, harness, drivers, or vehicles were unavailable. A hut that should have been tightened against weather might remain unfinished. Firewood might be harder to gather. Stores might sit in one place while men needed them in another. In that sense, the supply crisis was not a single empty warehouse. It was friction spread across thousands of small actions. Transport was especially important because Valley Forge was not isolated from the war. It sat near the Schuylkill River and Valley Creek, on ground chosen because Washington could watch the British in Philadelphia while keeping his army in a defensible position. But being well placed strategically did not mean being easily supplied. Food, clothing, tools, medicines, and other necessities had to come through systems of purchase, storage, packing, and movement. Wagons and teams were not decorative pieces of an army's rear. They were the bloodstream. Without them, beef, flour, blankets, shirts, shoes, tents, tools, and hospital supplies could exist somewhere in the region and still fail to reach the men who needed them. This is where the quartermaster department becomes central to the story. If the commissary department dealt with the purchasing, packing, and distribution of rations, the quartermaster's work reached into the broader physical life of the army. It involved the means by which an army moved, sheltered, equipped, and sustained itself in motion and in camp. At Valley Forge, that meant the practical world of wagons, teams, forage, tools, clothing, storage, and transportation. These were not secondary matters. They determined whether Washington's army could remain concentrated rather than scatter in search of relief. They determined whether orders could be carried out at the scale of a temporary military city. The problem was not that the army did not know it needed these things. The problem was creating a system strong enough to secure them under wartime pressure. The British occupation of Philadelphia distorted markets and movement. Farmers and suppliers weighed risk, payment, distance, and loyalty. Roads could become difficult in winter. Administrative authority could be divided or uncertain. Inflation and competition among purchasing agents made an already hard problem worse. The army's needs were immense, but its reach into the countryside depended on institutions that were still being tested and remade. By the spring of 1778, reform in this wider supply system became part of the army's recovery. Nathaniel Greene was appointed quartermaster general, a role that placed him at the center of the army's material machinery. Greene is often remembered as a battlefield commander, but at Valley Forge, his importance also lay in administration. The appointment mattered because survival required more than courage from the ranks. It required someone to make the movement of supplies more reliable, to bring greater order to transport, and to help connect the army's needs with the systems that could answer them. This was not glamorous work. It did not produce the instant drama of a charge or the visible climax of a battle line. A successful wagon train could disappear into routine. A repaired supply system could look, from a distance, like nothing happening. But for the men at Valley Forge, improvement could be felt in the ordinary objects of life. A blanket issued, a pair of shoes found, a tool available for labor, a wagon arriving where it was needed, a store moved before it spoiled or disappeared. Logistics, when it worked, did not always announce itself. It simply made continued existence possible. The lack of uniforms also carried meaning beyond appearance. Uniforms helped define an army as an army. They marked belonging, aided discipline, and gave physical form to military organization. At Valley Forge, where soldiers came from different states and brought different conditions of dress and equipment, the shortage of clothing and uniforms reinforced the larger challenge of holding a continental force together. Men could be brave, experienced, and loyal, yet still appear ragged, cold, and ill-supplied. The outward condition of the troops was not a measure of their willingness alone. It was a record of the Republic's capacity to support them. Medicines belonged to the same chain of necessities. In a crowded encampment with thousands of people, animals, huts, kitchens, roads, refuse, and hospitals pressed into one winter settlement, health could not be separated from supply. Surgeons and caregivers needed materials. Sick men needed more than sympathy. They needed space, attention, medicines, bedding, food, and some means of being separated when disease threatened to spread. Without those things, sickness could move through the camp with a force no enemy patrol could match. This is why the material crisis at Valley Forge cannot be reduced to a sentimental image of barefoot men in snow, powerful as that image remains. The bare feet were real, and they mattered. but they were part of a larger web. Shoes affected guard duty and marching. Blankets affected rest. Tools affected shelter. Transport affected every delivery. Clothing affected warmth and identity. Medicines affected whether illness became recovery or death. The Army's survival depended on the ordinary objects that allowed extraordinary endurance to continue. By spring, the appointment of Nathaniel Greene and the continuing work of supply reform did not erase the suffering that had already occurred. It did, however, show that Valley Forge was also a place of administrative learning. The Army was not merely enduring hardship, it was being forced to understand the machinery necessary to remain alive. Washington's command needed soldiers who would stay. It also needed departments that could feed, clothe, move, and equip them. The war for independence was fought in councils and campaigns, but it was also fought in ledgers, wagons, storehouses, and the slow correction of failure. Still, even better systems could not undo the danger already built into the camp. Thousands of weakened bodies had spent the winter in close quarters. Cold, hunger, poor clothing, and insufficient supplies had prepared the ground for a more silent enemy. Valley Forge had no great battle during the encampment, no field of massed combat to explain its dead. The deadliest force moved instead through breath, water, waste, crowded huts, and hospital spaces, turning the material hardships of the camp into a medical crisis that would define the cost of survival. The shortages of food, shoes, blankets, tools, transport, and medicine did not remain separate hardships. They met inside the human body. Hunger lowered resistance. Cold punished every exposed foot and uncovered shoulder. Crowded huts held warmth, but they also held breath, dampness, lice, and fever. A camp that could not always supply soap, clothing, or bedding could not easily defend itself against sickness. By the middle of the encampment, Valley Forge had become more than a test of endurance. It had become a medical landscape. This is the part of Valley Forge that can be hardest to picture, because the name carries the weight of war, and war often asks us to imagine combat first. Musket fire, cannon smoke, lines advancing across open ground. But during the winter encampment, there was no battle at Valley Forge. The National Park Service states that nearly 2,000 people died during the encampment, and most of those deaths came from disease rather than combat. The Army's deadliest enemy was not a British assault on the plateau. It was illness moving through a temporary city of soldiers, women, children, animals, huts, kitchens, roads, hospitals, and waste. That distinction matters. It changes the meaning of the place. Valley Forge was not only a scene of patriotic suffering, it was a warning about what happens when thousands of people are compressed into one military settlement, while supply, sanitation, nutrition, clothing, and medical capacity are all under strain. The camp was an army, but it was also a city without the stability of a city. It had to be built quickly. It had to be governed by orders. It had to place its kitchens, huts, hospitals, roads, and latrines in ways that could either slow disease or help it spread. And it had to do all of this while facing the British in Philadelphia, and while struggling to repair the administrative failures that had already brought the Army close to starvation, dissolution, or dispersal. The diseases named in accounts of the camp are not abstractions. Influenza could move through breath and close contact, exhausting men already weakened by hunger and cold. Typhus, associated with crowded and unclean conditions, belonged naturally to armies that could not keep clothing, bedding, and bodies clean enough. Typhoid fever and dysentery pointed toward the dangers of contaminated water, food, and waste. In a camp of more than 12,000 soldiers, joined by about 400 women and children, these diseases did not need a battlefield. They needed proximity. They needed fatigue. They needed the daily traffic of a military community. A soldier sick with dysentery was not simply ill in private. He became part of the camp's whole system of risk. Where did he sleep? Where did he relieve himself? Who carried water? Who washed clothing, if washing was possible? Who shared his hut? Who handled his blanket? Who brought food to him? Who moved him to a hospital? Every ordinary act could become a chain of exposure. In a small household, sickness could be isolated by distance. At Valley Forge, distance had to be created by order. That is why the medical world of the camp was inseparable from command. Hospitals were not just places where men went after becoming sick. They were instruments of survival for the entire army. Quarantine facilities were not signs of panic. They were attempts to prevent one case from becoming a wave. Sanitation orders were not minor regulations for tidiness. They were military measures. Surgeons and nurses were not working at the edge of the story. They stood near its center because the army's ability to remain in the field depended on whether the sick could be separated, treated, cleaned, fed, and watched without overwhelming the camp itself. The suffering at Valley Forge also belonged to the medical knowledge of the 18th century. Doctors and commanders did not possess modern germ theory, modern antibiotics, or modern public health systems. But they did understand, from hard experience, that crowding, filth, contaminated surroundings, and exposure could turn an encampment into a place of death. Armies had long known that disease could kill more men than battle. The Continental Army did not need a theory of microbes to recognize that waste, stagnant habits, dirty quarters, and uncontrolled illness could destroy military strength. Smallpox belonged to this world as well. It had haunted armies and communities across the war. At Valley Forge, smallpox inoculation was part of the medical landscape, not as a simple cure, but as a deliberate and risky preventive measure in an era when the disease could devastate an unprotected force. Inoculation required management. It demanded decisions about timing, isolation, care, and recovery. A soldier undergoing inoculation could not simply be treated as fully fit for duty. He needed to pass through a controlled period of illness or vulnerability before returning to strength. In a camp already short of supplies and men fit for service, even prevention had to be organized with military discipline. This is one reason disease cannot be separated from the earlier supply crisis. A man without shoes was more likely to become weakened. A man without a blanket slept colder. A man with poor food recovered more slowly. A camp without enough soap, medicines, clean clothing, or transport could not move efficiently from sickness to recovery. The shortages described in the commissary and quartermaster story became medical facts. They appeared in coughs, fevers, exhaustion, infected bodies, and hospital lists. Logistics did not merely feed the army. It shaped the army's immune defenses, though no one at the time would have phrased it that way. The numbers forced the point into focus. Nearly 2,000 dead in an encampment without a major battle is not a background detail. It is the central cost of the winter. Those deaths unfolded inside a place Washington had chosen for strategic reasons, close enough to watch British-occupied Philadelphia, defensible enough to protect the army, connected to the Schuylkill River and the surrounding roads, and capable of housing a force that still had to remain a threat. Yet defensible ground did not guarantee a healthy camp. Earthworks could slow an enemy. They could not stop influenza. A plateau could be militarily useful and medically dangerous at the same time. And the dead were not only a loss of life, though that would be enough. They were also a loss of military capacity. Every fever removed a man from the line. Every hospital bed represented labor that could not be performed, drill that could not be practiced, guard duty that had to be reassigned, roads that might not be improved, supplies that might not be moved, huts that might not be repaired. Sickness multiplied work for the healthy. It reduced the margin between an army that endured and an army that came apart. In that sense, disease tested loyalty and command as much as hunger did. Soldiers were being asked to remain in a camp where comfort was scarce and death was near, even though the enemy was not attacking them. It is one thing to risk death in battle, under orders, in a visible contest. It is another to watch men die in huts and hospitals while waiting for spring, supplies, news, reform, and movement. Valley Forge demanded a slower courage, the willingness to stay while danger had no drumbeat, no charge, no clear hour of decision. The presence of women and children deepens the picture. They were part of the army's world, and their lives were shaped by the same conditions of crowding, scarcity, and sickness. A military camp was not sealed off from domestic labor. Washing, nursing, cooking, carrying, and tending the sick all belonged to the survival of the force. Disease moved through this broader community, and care depended on people whose names often remained less visible than commanders and staff officers. Nurses and attendants helped make the difference between abandonment and treatment, between a sick man lying alone and a sick man remaining within the Army's fragile system of care. The medical crisis also helps explain why discipline at Valley Forge could not be reduced to drill alone. The army needed order in movement, order in supply, order in hut construction, and order in the use of space. It needed rules about where waste belonged, how the sick were handled, where hospitals were placed, and how contagious dangers were separated from the rest of the camp. The same army that would soon benefit from standardized training also had to learn, every day, that survival depended on habits. Cleanliness, spacing, inspection, removal of filth, and control of disease were not decorative improvements. They were defenses. There is a quiet tragedy in this. The Continental Army had survived the battlefield reverses of the previous campaign. It had kept itself near Philadelphia rather than disappearing into the countryside. It had built more than 1,500 huts and fortified its position. It had endured hunger, nakedness, and breakdowns in supply. Yet, after all of that labor, disease continued to pass through the camp with a power no redoubt could answer. Valley Forge refused to become a battlefield, but it still became a place of mass death. And still, the army did not die. That fact should not soften the suffering, but it does reveal the scale of the achievement. To keep an army together under fire is one kind of command. To keep it together while sickness empties huts, while hospitals fill, while rations fail, while clothing wears out, and while the enemy waits near the capital is another. Valley Forge survived because people worked against collapse on many fronts at once. Commanders issuing orders, surgeons treating the sick, nurses providing care, staff officers trying to repair supply, soldiers enduring discipline, and the camp itself slowly becoming more organized. The lesson of disease at Valley Forge is therefore not only that illness killed. It is that illness forced the army to become more deliberate about the conditions of life. A military city could not exist on courage alone. It required systems that reached into the most ordinary details: water, waste, bedding, air, hospitals, quarantine, inoculation, nursing, and cleanliness. The struggle against disease turned the camp into a place where order was not simply a matter of obedience. It was a matter of survival. Disease had already revealed the central truth of Valley Forge. An army could be defeated even when no enemy charged its lines. But once that truth was visible, the camp's survival depended on something less dramatic than battlefield courage and just as demanding. It depended on whether thousands of people could be made to live together without poisoning their own ground, their own water, and one another. Valley Forge was a military position, but it was also a crowded settlement. More than 12,000 soldiers had entered the encampment, along with about 400 women and children who were part of the army's moving world. They lived among huts, roads, livestock, kitchens, hospitals, headquarters, workshops, stores, and defensive works. Smoke rose from chimneys. Wagons cut paths through mud and frozen earth. Men stood guard, cooked, drilled, repaired equipment, searched for fuel, and carried the sick. In that kind of place, sanitation was not a refinement. It was infrastructure. The word can sound modern, almost too clean for the winter landscape of 1777 and 1778. But the problem was ancient and immediate. Where would waste go? Where would the sick be placed? How could contaminated spaces be separated from healthy ones? How could bedding, clothing, water, and air be managed when supplies were short and men were crowded together? A camp could be laid out with military precision and still become deadly if those questions were ignored. This is why hospitals at Valley Forge were not simply rooms where suffering was gathered. They were part of a larger attempt to impose order on illness. The camp needed places where the sick could be treated, watched, and separated from the routines of the healthy. It needed medical staff who could decide who remained in the huts, who moved to hospital care, and who required isolation. Surgeons worked in a world of limited medicine, limited supplies, and overwhelming need, but their work mattered not only because they treated individual patients. It mattered because they helped the army sort illness before it consumed the whole settlement. That sorting was one of the essential acts of survival. A man with fever was not only a suffering body. In a crowded hut, he could become a source of further infection. A man with dysentery raised questions about waste, bedding, clothing, and water. A man suspected of smallpox belonged not merely to the medical story, but to the security of the entire camp. Disease made every body public. It turned private sickness into a matter of command. Quarantine facilities belonged to that same logic. They were an admission that discipline sometimes meant distance. The Continental Army could not afford to let contagious disease move freely through its huts and workspaces. Quarantine did not cure hunger, and it did not supply shoes or blankets. But it offered one of the few tools available against diseases that thrived on contact, crowding, and movement. In a camp within reach of British-occupied Philadelphia, where Washington needed the army near enough to watch the enemy, yet strong enough to remain in being, the separation of the sick from the well was not merely humane. It was strategic. Smallpox made this especially clear. The medical world of the camp included inoculation, a practice that carried its own risks and required management. Inoculation was not just an individual choice made in isolation from army life. It had to be fitted into the structure of a military camp, because inoculated men could not simply continue all duties as if nothing had happened. They needed supervision and time. They had to be kept from spreading illness while the process did its work. In that sense, inoculation was both medical treatment and administrative burden. It required planning, space, staff, and command authority. The same was true of cleanliness. The Army's official ration included weekly issues of vinegar and soap, items that can disappear behind the more desperate language of bread and meat. But vinegar and soap remind us that survival depended on more than calories. They belonged to the maintenance of bodies, clothing, utensils, and spaces. When supplies failed, the damage was not limited to hunger. Shortages weakened the very practices that helped keep disease contained. Sanitation orders therefore carried life and death weight. Orders about cleanliness, waste, and camp arrangement were not ornamental rules imposed by officers far from suffering. They were attempts to keep a temporary city from turning against itself. A soldier ordered to clean, move, dig, air, or maintain a space was not being asked merely to satisfy military neatness. He was being drawn into the health system of the Army. This is one of the quieter transformations of Valley Forge. Discipline is often remembered through drill, formations, and battlefield movement. Those things mattered, and they would matter even more as the Army became more standardized. But discipline also lived in the placement of refuse, the care of bedding, the management of hospital spaces, and the effort to keep contaminated conditions from multiplying. Courage could hold a line for a moment. Cleanliness and order helped hold a camp for months. Women in the camp were part of that world as well. The encampment was not made only of soldiers and officers. It included women and children, and within the medical system, nurses provided care that helped sustain the sick through the long crisis. Nursing was intimate work in a dangerous environment. It meant contact with fever, weakness, soiled bedding, and human fear. It also meant that the Army's survival rested partly on labor that did not always appear in the grand language of campaigns. Washing, feeding, tending, carrying, watching, and comforting could become acts of military preservation. The hospitals themselves carried a grim contradiction. They were necessary because they concentrated care, but concentration could also concentrate misery. A hospital without adequate cleanliness, air, supplies, or separation could become a dangerous place. The same mechanism that gathered the sick for treatment could allow disease to spread among them. Valley Forge's medical challenge was therefore not solved by naming a place a hospital. It depended on how that place functioned, how staff managed it, and whether the broader camp could support it with food, fuel, bedding, medicine, and order. This is where the previous crises of the encampment all converged. Food shortages lowered resistance. Clothing shortages exposed bodies to cold and damp. Lack of blankets affected rest and recovery. Shortages of medicine limited treatment. Transport problems made every movement of supplies, patients, and materials more difficult. The commissary department and quartermaster department may seem separate from sanitation, but in daily life, their failures and improvements shaped health. A hospital needed provisions. A quarantine facility needed space and support. Cleanliness needed soap. The removal or control of waste required tools and labor. Survival was a chain, and disease found every weak link. By the winter and spring of 1778, Valley Forge was forcing the Continental Army to think like an institution, not merely a collection of regiments enduring hardship. A regiment could be brave. A camp had to be managed. A soldier could suffer quietly. An army had to count, separate, clean, feed, supply, treat, and command. The scale of the place demanded systems. That scale is easy to underestimate because the most enduring images of Valley Forge often reduce it to snow, bare feet, and endurance. Those images are not meaningless, but they are incomplete. The camp was also latrines and hospitals, orders and inspections, nurses and surgeons, contaminated bedding and attempts to control it, inoculation programs and quarantine spaces, weakened men and the effort to prevent weakness from becoming epidemic collapse. It was a place where the ordinary materials of life became military necessities. The dead, nearly 2,000 according to the National Park Service, remind us of the limits of those systems. Valley Forge was not saved because its sanitation was perfect or because its medical care could defeat every disease. It was saved because the Army continued struggling to organize life under conditions that repeatedly threatened to break it. The point is not that order erased suffering. The point is that without order, the suffering could have become final. In that sense, sanitation belonged beside fortification. The redoubts and earthworks helped defend the army from the British. Hospitals, quarantine, inoculation, and cleanliness helped defend the army from the camp itself. One defense faced outward toward Philadelphia. The other faced inward toward the dangers produced by crowding, hunger, waste, and infection. For Washington, these were not abstract problems. They arrived as reports, requests, shortages, deaths, and decisions. They moved through the paperwork of command and the cramped routines of headquarters. Near the meeting of Valley Creek in the Schuylkill River and the Isaac Potts House, the commander-in-chief and his military household worked within the same larger emergency that shaped the huts and hospitals beyond the door. The survival of Valley Forge was decided not in one dramatic moment, but through countless acts of management, many of them written, argued, copied, carried, and answered inside that house. Those decisions did not float above the camp. They had an address. Near the place where Valley Creek flows into the Schuylkill River stood the Isaac Potts House, a modest stone building that became Washington's headquarters during the Valley Forge encampment. Built circa 1773 by the Potts family, it had not been designed as the nerve center of a continental war. It was a house in a working landscape, close to water, roads, mills, and the remains of a village already scarred by the conflict. Yet in the winter of 1777 and 1778, its rooms became one of the most important military spaces in North America. The contrast matters. Valley Forge is often remembered through the open camp, the hut lines, the frozen ground, the smoke, the sick rooms, the bare feet, the earthworks on the heights. But command also had a physical texture. It happened in rooms too small for the size of the crisis. It happened at desks, beside fireplaces, near windows looking out toward the roads and waterways that connected the Army to Congress, to Philadelphia, to supply depots, to hospitals, and to the countryside from which food and transport had to be drawn. The Isaac Potts House concentrated the war into paper. Reports arrived there from the brigades. Requests came in from officers who needed food, shoes, blankets, tools, wagons, medicines, or permission to act. Letters went out to Congress, to state governments, to commissary officials, to quartermaster officers, to commanders posted around the region. A decision made in that house might affect whether cattle moved toward camp, whether a brigade received flour, whether a hospital received attention, whether discipline could be maintained, or whether the Army's grievances would remain contained. This was not the romance of command. It was its burden. Washington's headquarters was crowded not only with problems, but with people. The commander-in-chief did not work alone. Around him stood a military household, a staff structure that allowed the Army's business to move. Among the aides-de-camp at Valley Forge were John Laurens and Alexander Hamilton, young officers whose work was essential to the daily machinery of command. They drafted, copied, translated, organized, and carried the voice of the commander into written form. In a war fought by armies, politics, supply systems, and fragile institutions, the aide-de-camp was not merely a messenger. He was part of the command system itself. Inside headquarters, the Army became sentences. Washington's warnings, frustrations, instructions, and appeals had to be shaped into language precise enough to move men and institutions. A shortage in the camp might become a letter to Congress. A breakdown in supply might become a demand for reform. A report of men unfit for duty might become evidence of a system failing under pressure. The crisis of Valley Forge passed through hands that dipped pens, folded sheets, copied orders, sealed dispatches, and sent riders into uncertain roads. The house was also sustained by labor that military history has too often pushed to the edge of the frame. Washington's household at Valley Forge included salaried and enslaved servants, among them Elizabeth Thompson and Hannah Till. Their presence reminds us that headquarters was not only a command post, it was a lived space. Fires had to be kept. Food had to be prepared when food was available. Rooms had to function. Clothing, bedding, cleaning, errands, and domestic order all mattered because the command structure depended on the ordinary work that made a headquarters usable. Elizabeth Thompson served as part of Washington's wartime household. Hannah Till, an enslaved woman, was also present in that world of service and labor. To name them is not a decorative detail. It changes the room. It reminds us that the Army's survival rested not only on generals, aides, and departments, but on people whose work made daily operations possible while remaining far from the formal language of command. In the same house where letters addressed Congress and senior officers, domestic labor helped maintain the conditions under which those letters could be written at all. The headquarters, then, was both military and domestic, public and private, strategic and cramped. It held the commander-in-chief, his aides, servants, messengers, visitors, and the constant movement of documents. Outside its walls, more than 12,000 soldiers and hundreds of women and children lived in the temporary city of Valley Forge. Inside, Washington and his household faced the pressure of governing that city, while also watching the British in Philadelphia. That pressure was constant because Valley Forge was never isolated from the larger war. The British Army occupied Philadelphia, close enough to remain a strategic danger. Washington had chosen ground that allowed him to observe and respond, but observation required information. Headquarters depended on reports from the field, on intelligence, on the movement of riders, and on the ability to turn scattered news into decisions. In that sense, the Isaac Potts house was connected by invisible lines to the Schuylkill River, Valley Creek, the road network, the Hut City, the supply departments, and the occupied capital beyond. The house stood at a meeting point of geography and responsibility. The Schuylkill River was more than scenery. Valley Creek was more than a nearby stream. Together, they placed headquarters within the landscape that had made Valley Forge useful, defensible, connected, and close enough to Philadelphia to matter. But the same location also meant that the commander-in-chief lived beside the daily evidence of the Army's dependence on movement. Food had to move. Letters had to move. Orders had to move. Sick men had to be separated, treated, or transported. Cattle had to be driven in. Wagons had to be found. Cloth, shoes, blankets, and tools had to arrive by systems that were often strained or failing. Washington's headquarters became the place where those failures were translated into urgency. The earlier crisis over food had already shown what could happen when the commissary system faltered. The Army could not live on official ration tables if purchasing, packing, transport, and distribution broke down. The shortages of clothing and shoes had shown that a soldier might be counted on the rolls and still be unable to stand in line for duty. Disease had shown that a camp could lose men even without battle. Each of these problems entered headquarters not as a general theme, but as a sequence of specific demands. How many men were fit? Which brigades lacked provisions? Which departments were responsible? Who had failed to deliver? Which state authorities needed to be pressed? Which officers could be trusted to act? Which orders would preserve discipline without breaking morale? This was the command war of Valley Forge. It was less visible than a battlefield and less easily commemorated. There were no ranks of smoke rolling across an open field, no charge to fix in the public memory. Instead, there was the slow grind of administration under emergency conditions. But that grind was decisive. An army that could not manage paper could not manage bread. An army that could not issue orders clearly could not maintain discipline across hotlines, hospitals, guards, and supply routes. An army that could not connect its commander to Congress and its departments could not survive long as a national force. The Isaac Potts House made this visible because it gathered the Army's contradictions under one roof. Washington was the symbol of resolve, but he was also a manager surrounded by scarcity. Lawrence and Hamilton were ambitious young officers, but their daily importance lay in the disciplined work of correspondence and staff duty. Elizabeth Thompson and Hannah Till were part of the headquarters world, reminding us that command depended on labor beyond the officer corps. The house itself was small, but the responsibilities passing through it were immense. It was an ordinary building made extraordinary by pressure, and pressure could also produce reform. By the late winter and spring of 1778, Valley Forge was not merely enduring hardship, it was changing under it. The supply departments were being forced toward reorganization. The quartermaster department would be strengthened by the appointment of Nathaniel Greene. The commissary crisis would push new leadership into place. Sanitation, hospitals, and inoculation were part of a broader recognition that survival required systems, not only courage. Headquarters was where many of those systems had to meet. It was where military command encountered civilian authority. It was where the needs of the huts became arguments to Congress. It was where the suffering of soldiers became evidence for reform. It was where the Army's daily weakness had to be turned into plans that might keep it from dissolving. Then, on February 23, 1778, another kind of reform entered the camp. Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge with a different answer to the same central problem. If the army was going to survive, it needed food, clothing, medicine, sanitation, and transport. But it also needed a common military language. It needed its soldiers to move, load, march, and form with shared discipline rather than separate habits. And the work of building that system would soon draw directly on the world of headquarters itself, including John Lawrence and Alexander Hamilton, as the Army's struggle for survival began to turn toward training, standardization, and a new confidence in the field. The reform that entered Valley Forge on February 23, 1778, did not arrive as a wagon load of flour or a herd of cattle. It did not warm the huts, fill the hospitals, or put shoes on every bare foot. It came in the form of a Prussian officer with a long European military education and a belief that an army could be strengthened by teaching its men to act together. Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben arrived at a camp that had already learned the limits of courage. The soldiers had endured hunger, cold, sickness, and uncertainty. Washington's headquarters had become a place where letters, reports, complaints, and desperate requests passed through crowded rooms near Valley Creek and the Schuylkill River. The Army had survived long enough to prove that it would not simply disappear. But survival was not the same as readiness. If the Continental Army was to move from winter endurance back into campaigning, it needed more than persistence. It needed a system. Von Steuben's answer was discipline, but not discipline as punishment alone. His work at Valley Forge was not merely about making men stand straighter. It was about standardizing the habits of an army that had grown out of different states, different officers, different local practices, and different levels of experience. A soldier from one line might have learned a movement one way, another might have learned it differently. Commands, formations, marching, loading, and battlefield movement could vary from unit to unit. In a camp already strained by shortages, disease, and administrative failure, that lack of common method mattered. Disorder cost time. Confusion cost strength. On a battlefield, it could cost lives. Washington made von Steuben temporary inspector general, giving him a position from which he could begin to reshape the Army's daily practice. The title mattered because inspection was not just a ceremony. It implied standards. It meant watching how units formed, how officers instructed, how soldiers handled their weapons, and how commands moved through the ranks. In an army fighting for independence while depending on fragile systems of supply and support, the Inspector General's work touched the deeper question of whether the Continental Army could become a unified force rather than a collection of brave but uneven parts. The setting for that work was not a polished parade ground far from suffering. It was Valley Forge itself. Around the drill spaces stood the evidence of the winter city: huts, smoke, mud, hospitals, roads, livestock, headquarters, and the daily search for food and clothing. Men came to training from a camp where official rations had often existed more securely on paper than in their kettles. Some had been sick. Some had marched without proper shoes. Some had watched comrades die, not from musket fire, but from disease. Von Steuben's reforms did not erase those conditions. Instead, they took place inside them. That is part of why they mattered. Training was not a luxury added after the crisis was over. It was one of the ways the Army tried to climb out of crisis. Von Steuben began with a practical method. Rather than attempting to instruct the entire Army all at once, he created a model company. The company included Washington's commander-in-chief's guard and men drawn from each state, about 120 men in total. It was a small enough group to teach directly, yet broad enough to carry the lesson outward. These men would learn the standardized drill, and then their example would become a living manual for others. The choice was intelligent. Valley Forge was not simply a camp of isolated regiments. It was a military city made of many parts, and reform had to spread through those parts. If von Steuben could teach one carefully chosen company, he could turn those men into demonstrators. Officers and soldiers could watch the movements performed correctly. They could see the pace, the sequence, the posture, the handling of arms, and the response to command. The model company made instruction visible. It transformed drill from words into motion. There is a quiet drama in that image, about 120 men, taken from Washington's guard and from the states, standing in the open air of a winter camp where the army had nearly been broken by want. Around them, the war's larger machinery still creaked and strained. Commissary reform was still necessary. Quartermaster reform was still necessary. Hospitals and sanitation still mattered. But on the drill field, another kind of repair was underway. The army was repairing its shared language. The commander-in-chief's guard carried symbolic weight in this process. As Washington's own guard, it stood close to the authority of headquarters. Its participation helped connect von Steuben's instruction to the command center of the army. The men drawn from each state gave the company a wider meaning. They represented the army's federal character, its mixture of state identities under a continental cause. By training them together, von Steuben was doing more than teaching movements. He was demonstrating that a common standard could be learned across state lines. Around this training world moved some of the same figures who had already appeared inside Washington's headquarters. John Laurens and Alexander Hamilton, aides-de-camp to Washington, belonged to the paper and command environment where reform had to be recorded, translated, transmitted, and defended. Von Steuben's ideas could not remain only in his voice on the field. They had to pass into language other officers could use. They had to become orders, explanations, and eventually a system. Pierre-Étienne Duponceau became part of this world as well. So did Benjamin Walker. François de Fleury and Pierre-Charles L'Enfant were also connected to the training environment around reform. These names remind us that Valley Forge was not sealed off from the wider Atlantic military world. The Continental Army was American in purpose, but it was learning from European experience, French-speaking intermediaries, engineers, aides, and officers who helped carry knowledge across languages and institutions. The camp's reform was not one man shouting commands into the cold. It was a network of instruction, translation, observation, and adoption. Von Steuben's presence also reveals something important about Washington's leadership at Valley Forge. Washington did not merely endure the winter and wait for spring. He accepted that the army had to be rebuilt while it was still suffering. He had to preserve morale, fight for supplies, manage political relationships, and at the same time make room for professional reform. The arrival of von Steuben gave him a tool for one part of that work. It offered a way to turn the army's enforced pause into preparation. The drill itself carried meaning beyond the visible motions. When soldiers learned to move together, they learned trust in sequence. A command given at one point in the line had to be understood by men many places away. Loading, forming, marching, and responding could not depend on individual instinct alone. The army had to act as a body. That requirement was not decorative. In 18th century warfare, formation and timing were central to how armies survived and fought. Confusion in movement could leave units vulnerable. Discipline could hold them together under pressure. For men who had spent the winter in a camp defined by scarcity, drill may also have offered a different rhythm. Hunger and illness produced uncertainty. Supply failures made tomorrow hard to imagine. Training imposed repetition. It said, this movement will be done this way. This command will mean this action. This unit will respond together. In a place where so much had been irregular, the drill field created regularity. It could not feed the men, but it could help restore confidence that the army still had shape. That confidence was not abstract. Valley Forge's importance lies partly in this transformation from endurance to capability. The army that had entered the camp in December had been forced to build shelter, survive shortages, manage disease, and remain near the British in Philadelphia without being destroyed. By late winter and spring, the work of reform added another layer. The soldiers were not only waiting out the season, they were becoming more uniform in practice. Von Steuben's model company helped make that possible because it gave reform a method of expansion. First, a selected group learned. Then others observed. Officers carried lessons back. Movements became repeatable. The same commands could be used in different units. What began with about 120 men could reach far beyond them because the purpose was never to create an elite display company only for headquarters. The purpose was to create a pattern the Army could copy. In that sense, the model company was a bridge between the human and the institutional. It was made of individual soldiers, each with his own winter behind him. But it pointed towards something larger, an army governed by shared standards. The men became the first page of a manual not yet fully fixed in print. Their bodies demonstrated what later words would preserve. The presence of Duponceau, Lawrence, Hamilton, Walker, de Fleury, and L'Enfant around this world of reform helps us see how practical knowledge moved. A drill system had to be explained across language, rank, and habit. It had to pass from von Steuben's instruction into the understanding of American officers. It had to fit the Army as it existed, not as a European theorist might imagine it. The work required adaptation. It required people who could listen, translate, write, demonstrate, and persuade. This was another kind of survival at Valley Forge. Earlier, survival had meant keeping men from starving, freezing, deserting, or dying of disease. Now it also meant preserving the Army as a fighting instrument. An army could remain alive and still be ineffective. Von Steuben's reforms addressed that danger. He gave the Continental Army a clearer way to become useful in the field once the winter ended. The cinematic memory of Valley Forge often lingers on snow, bare feet, and smoke rising from huts. Those images are powerful because suffering was real. But if the story stops there, it misses the sound that began to rise through the camp in late winter, the repeated command, the answered movement, the step taken together. On those drill grounds, amid the unfinished work of supply and health, the Army practiced becoming more than a collection of survivors. The model company did not solve every problem. It did not end disease. It did not repair the commissary by itself. It did not turn the winter camp into an effortless machine. But it gave the Army something it had lacked in consistent form, a common military grammar. From Washington's Guard and Men of the States, von Steuben built a demonstration of order that could be copied across the lines. And once that order could be spoken, shown, and repeated, it could also be written down. The lessons of Valley Forge were beginning to move from the drill field into text, from temporary instruction into lasting regulation, from the voice of a trainer in camp toward a manual that would carry the memory of reform far beyond the winter city. The movement that had begun as a voice on the drill field did not remain there. A command shouted across packed earth, a correction made to a line of tired men, a lesson repeated by the model company until others could imitate it. All of this had a fragile life if it depended only on memory. Valley Forge had taught the Army that survival required systems. Food had to be purchased, packed, and delivered. Clothing had to be found, transported, and issued. Hospitals had to be managed. Sanitation had to be ordered. And now drill itself had to be fixed into a form that could outlast the camp. Von Steuben's work at Valley Forge was not simply the instruction of a few soldiers in front of other soldiers. It was the beginning of a shared military method. The Continental Army had been built from states, local habits, varying experience, and emergency improvisation. Men had marched into the war through different routes under different officers with different levels of training. Courage was not the same thing as coordination. Endurance was not the same thing as discipline. A line of men could be brave and still move unevenly. A regiment could be loyal and still lose time because its commands were not understood in the same way from one unit to another. This was the problem von Steuben attacked. At Valley Forge, he used demonstration to make order visible. The model company, formed from Washington's commander-in-chief's guard and men drawn from the states, showed how a movement should look before it was copied through the Army. But the next step was more difficult. What had been taught in person had to become portable. It had to travel beyond the men who first saw it. It had to be readable by officers who had not stood close to von Steuben's gestures or heard the exact rhythm of his instruction. It had to become a manual. The first language of that manual was French. That fact carries the international character of the American war into the smallest mechanics of soldiering. Valley Forge was not an isolated clearing where one national army invented itself alone. Its reform moved through languages, alliances, and personal networks. Von Steuben, a Prussian officer, worked in a camp commanded by George Washington, assisted by men who could help bridge his military knowledge into a form the Continental Army could use. His drills were first written in French and then translated into English with help from Pierre-Étienne Duponceau, John Lawrence, and Alexander Hamilton. The names matter because they show that the making of the army was not only done by bayonets and boots. It was also done by pens, translation, and staff work. Duponceau, Lawrence, and Hamilton were part of the world around Washington's headquarters, the world of letters, orders, drafts, and decisions. Their work helped convert spoken instruction into institutional language. A motion learned by a company became a sentence. A sentence became a regulation. A regulation became a standard that could be carried to another camp, another regiment, another year. Translation was not a small clerical detail. In military practice, words can move bodies. A command must mean the same thing to the officer giving it and the soldier receiving it. A manual must describe not only what should happen, but when, in what sequence, and with what purpose. If the language is uncertain, the movement becomes uncertain. If the movement is uncertain, the line becomes vulnerable. The army that had endured hunger, cold, and disease at Valley Forge was learning that precision itself could be a form of strength. The result of this work became regulations for the order and discipline of the troops of the United States. Congress approved it in March 1779, after the Army had already left Valley Forge. That timing is important. The book did not freeze the winter encampment as a memory of suffering. It carried forward one of its most durable products. Valley Forge had been the place where reform was tested under pressure, but the regulation made that reform part of the Army's continuing life. The manual became known as the Blue Book. Its name is simple, almost plain, but its importance was broad. It was used by the United States Army until 1814. That means the instruction shaped at Valley Forge did not end with the march out of camp, or with the battle that soon followed, or even with the immediate crisis of the Revolution. It entered the memory of the institution. It helped define how soldiers were expected to stand, move, obey, and act together. In that sense, Valley Forge survived not only in stories of snow and hunger, but in the daily habits of military discipline. The Blue Book gives another answer to the question of what Valley Forge means. The popular memory often returns to suffering: bare feet, empty stomachs, sickness in the huts, the long strain of holding an army together while the British occupied Philadelphia. Those things were real. Nearly 2,000 people died during the encampment, mostly from disease. Shortages of food, clothing, shoes, blankets, tools, transport, uniforms, medicines, and other necessities shaped the life of the camp. Washington had warned Congress that failure in the commissary system could lead to starvation, dissolution, or dispersal. Valley Forge cannot be understood without that misery. But misery alone did not create the army that marched out. Hunger does not automatically produce professionalism. Disease does not automatically produce discipline. Suffering can destroy an army as easily as harden it. What mattered at Valley Forge was that inside the crisis, men kept building systems. They built huts. They built fortifications. They built hospitals and supply channels as best they could. They built headquarters routines of letters and responses. And with von Steuben's instruction, they began building a common military language. This is where the legacy changes shape. Valley Forge was not only an ordeal endured by individuals. It was a place where the Continental Army became more standardized. The difference is quiet, but decisive. Standardization means that a soldier in one unit is not entirely separated from a soldier in another by local custom. It means officers can rely on shared procedures. It means training can be repeated rather than reinvented. It means the Army can carry itself with more coherence when it leaves the protective boundaries of camp and enters open movement again. On the drill field, a man learned where to place his body. In the manual, the Army learned where to place its memory. That memory was not sentimental. It was practical. The Blue Book did not preserve the smoke of the huts or the pain of the hospitals. It preserved regulation. It turned the experience of reform into instructions that could be taught again. For an army born amid emergency, this was a step toward permanence. It suggested that the United States would need not only soldiers for the present campaign, but disciplined structures for future service. There is a quiet irony in that. Valley Forge became famous as a place where the Army nearly came apart. Yet, one of its lasting achievements was a manual of order. The camp that exposed weakness also produced a method for overcoming weakness. The Winter City had shown what happened when supply failed, when clothing was inadequate, when sickness spread, when administration lagged behind need. But it also showed that military life could be regularized, corrected, and taught. It showed that reform could be written into the bones of the institution. By March 1779, when Congress approved the regulations for the order and discipline of the troops of the United States, Valley Forge was no longer occupied by Washington's Winter Army. The huts had been left behind. The lines that had once filled with smoke, sickness, work parties, sentries, wagons, and drill had passed into memory. But the instruction that grew there had not vanished. It had moved from the ground to the page. It could now travel wherever the army traveled. And that movement from place to page is one of the most important transitions in the story. Valley Forge did not end when the snow melted. It did not end when the worst of the supply crisis eased. It did not end when the men could form more cleanly under command. Its lessons continued because they had been organized. They had been translated. They had been approved. They had been made official. The army that had arrived in December 1777 was hungry, strained, and uneven. The army that would leave in June 1778 was still imperfect, still dependent on fragile systems, still vulnerable to disease and shortage. But it had gained something more than endurance. It had gained a clearer sense of itself as an army capable of common action. Soon the camp would no longer be the center of the story. News from beyond Pennsylvania would change the atmosphere. The French alliance would lift the strategic horizon. The British would leave Philadelphia. Washington's army would move out of Valley Forge on June 19th, 1778, not into legend, but onto roads leading toward New Jersey and another test in the field. Yet as it marched, it carried more than the memory of hunger. It carried the discipline shaped on the drill ground and the beginnings of the Blue Book that would keep Valley Forge alive in the practice of the United States Army for decades. By the time the lessons of the drill field were beginning to harden into common practice, Valley Forge was already changing in another way. The camp that had been built for endurance was becoming a place of expectation. The huts still stood. The roads were still worn by wagons, livestock, messengers, and men. The hospitals and supply offices had not vanished. Hunger, sickness, and shortage had not become memories overnight. But the army that had entered the encampment in December 1777 was no longer waiting in the same darkness. In May 1778, news reached Washington that changed the strategic atmosphere around the camp. France had entered into alliance with the United States. For the soldiers at Valley Forge, this was not an abstract diplomatic achievement sealed far away across the ocean. It meant that the war was widening. It meant that the American cause was no longer standing entirely alone against British power. It meant that the army which had survived the winter in Pennsylvania could imagine itself as part of a larger struggle, with new weight behind it and new possibilities ahead. The news came to men who had known what it meant for promises to exist only on paper. They had seen ration lists that could not always be fulfilled. They had watched the commissary department struggle to purchase, pack, and distribute food. They had felt the absence of shoes, blankets, clothing, tools, transport, uniforms, medicines, and other necessities. They had lived through the moment when Washington warned Congress that without reform, the Army might face starvation, dissolution, or dispersal. They had seen disease become the deadliest force in camp, taking lives with a steadier hand than British musket fire. So when word of the French alliance spread through Valley Forge, its power lay partly in contrast. The army had endured months in which survival was measured in flour, beef, soap, vinegar, shoes, straw, wagons, and hospital space. Now the horizon expanded. Diplomacy, sea power, European rivalry, and the recognition of the United States as a partner in war all pressed into the emotional life of the camp. The same men who had drilled under Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, the same men who had lined up in huts and on parade grounds, were hearing that the war itself had changed around them. On May 6, 1778, the Army marked French Alliance Day at Valley Forge. The celebration mattered because it showed a shift in morale, but also because it took place within the very landscape of suffering. It was not a victory parade after a clean triumph. It was a public act of confidence inside a camp where nearly 2,000 people would die during the encampment, mostly from disease. It was a ceremony held by an army that had been wounded not by one catastrophic battle, but by months of attrition, exposure, administrative failure, and illness. The French alliance did not feed every hungry soldier. It did not empty the hospitals. It did not erase the graves. But it made endurance feel connected to strategy. The army had not suffered merely to remain in place. It had held together long enough for the larger war to turn. That distinction matters. Valley Forge was never only a story of misery. It was a story of whether misery would break military purpose. By May, the answer was becoming clearer. Still, the decision to leave Valley Forge did not come because the camp had become comfortable. It came because the enemy moved. The British had occupied Philadelphia since 1777, turning the American capital into the center of their position in the region. Washington had chosen Valley Forge because it allowed him to watch British movements while keeping the Continental Army in a defensible place roughly a day's march away. Through the winter and spring, that relationship defined the camp. Philadelphia was the British prize. Valley Forge was the American counterweight. Between them lay roads, rivers, farms, foraging parties, supply problems, and the constant question of what the British would do next. In June 1778, the British evacuated Philadelphia. The strategic balance that had made Valley Forge necessary now changed again. Washington's army was no longer holding its winter ground under the shadow of an occupied capital. The British were moving, and the Continental Army had to move as well. On June 19, 1778, exactly 6 months after its arrival, Washington's army marched out of Valley Forge in pursuit. The date closes the encampment with a precision that can seem almost theatrical. December 19th to June 19th. But the departure was not a neat ending in the lives of the people who had survived there. The sick did not simply become well because the army marched. The systems that had failed did not become perfect because the roads opened. The soldiers who stepped away from the huts carried the physical memory of the place with them, weakened bodies, repaired clothing, hard-won habits, and the knowledge of how close an army could come to breaking without actually breaking. They also carried new forms of order. Von Steuben's work had not transformed the Continental Army into a European machine overnight, but it had given officers and soldiers a more common language of movement. The Model Company, drawn from Washington's Commander-in-Chief's Guard and men from the States, had shown that drill could be demonstrated, copied, and standardized. Commands first written in French and translated into English with the help of Pierre-Étienne Duponceau, John Laurens, and Alexander Hamilton, had begun to move from practice toward regulation. The later Blue Book would preserve that process beyond the encampment, but the first test was more immediate. Could the army that had learned in camp move and fight on campaign? The roads out of Valley Forge led toward New Jersey. Washington's army pursued the British as they moved away from Philadelphia, and soon the two armies would meet near Monmouth Courthouse. The Battle of Monmouth, fought later in June 1778, is often described as a tactical draw or standstill. That description is important because it resists the simplest kind of legend. Valley Forge did not produce a miraculous army that suddenly swept the British from the field. It produced an army that could remain in the war, move after its enemy, and stand under pressure. That was no small result. For months, the greatest danger at Valley Forge had been disappearance. Not defeat in a formal battle. Not the loss of a single day's ground. Disappearance. Men could desert. Units could dissolve. Disease could hollow out the ranks, all ranks. Hunger could destroy discipline. Civilian institutions could fail to support the military force they had created. Washington understood this danger when he wrote of starvation, dissolution, or dispersal. Those words were not rhetoric. They described the possible death of the army without a battlefield. And yet, on June 19th, The army marched. The image is quieter than many scenes in the American Revolution. There is no famous charge at Valley Forge, no single cannon shot that explains the place. There are huts left behind, earthworks, trampled roads, ashes, refuse, graves, and the altered ground of a temporary military city. There is the Isaac Potts House, where Washington's headquarters had received reports, letters, officers, aides, servants, and the daily burden of command. There are the traces of a camp where more than 12,000 soldiers and about 400 women and children had lived through a season of hardship. There is a landscape that had held kitchens, hospitals, supply offices, parade grounds, and lines of log huts, and then watched them empty. The absence of a battle at Valley Forge is not a weakness in its story. It is the reason the story matters. War is not only decided where armies fire at one another. It is also decided where they wait, hunger, sicken, organize, argue, train, bury their dead, and choose not to fall apart. Valley Forge forces us to look at those parts of war that are less visible but just as decisive: the ration that must arrive, the shoe that must hold, the wagon that must move, the hospital that must function, the order that must be obeyed, the trust that must survive another day. By the time Washington's army left, it had not escaped weakness. It had not solved every problem of supply, health, or command. It remained an army dependent on fragile systems and human endurance. But it had passed through the ordeal with its essential identity intact. More than that, it had become more coherent. The encampment had tested the relationship between soldiers and Congress, between military necessity and civilian administration, between suffering and discipline, between local survival and international strategy. The French alliance gave the cause a wider horizon. The British evacuation of Philadelphia gave the army a road to follow. Monmouth would give it another field on which to prove that it could stand. But Valley Forge had already answered the most urgent question of the winter. Could the Continental Army survive without a battle to define its courage? It did. It survived hunger that exposed the weakness of supply. It survived disease that killed more relentlessly than combat. It survived shortages of clothing, shoes, blankets, tools, transport, uniforms, and medicine. It survived administrative confusion, political strain, and the hard weather of a long encampment. It survived as soldiers learned new discipline and commanders wrestled systems into better shape. It survived while the British held Philadelphia, and it was still alive when the British left. That is why Valley Forge endures in memory. Not because it was the death of the army, and not because suffering alone ennobles a cause. It endures because suffering did not finish the army. The men and women who passed through that winter city did not experience a symbol. They experienced cold, hunger, illness, labor, fear, boredom, duty, and grief. The symbol came later, built from the fact that the army marched away. On June 19th, 1778, the Continental Army left Valley Forge and moved toward New Jersey. Behind it lay 6 months of deprivation and reform. Ahead lay Monmouth Courthouse and the continuing war. In that movement, the meaning of the encampment becomes clear. Valley Forge was not where the army died. It was where, against hunger, disease, and the steady pressure of collapse, it refused to die.